Hi, I'm Andrew Torres, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 79 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the Serial Mormon History podcast. Today is Thursday, November 30th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today begins part 2 of our dive into the history of polygamy, and we're going to focus in on Joseph Smith and Mormonism specifically. Before getting started, let me give you a little peek behind the curtains, or into the hat, or, whatever euphemism you prefer. In the past few weeks, I've experienced a powerful reinvigoration. I've been picking up tidbits of Mormon polygamy for years now, and have accrued just enough knowledge to feel comfortable with the topic, but as of very recently, diving much deeper into this subject where I've only scratched the surface before, I've experienced a bit of a personal renaissance in my love for Mormon history. Today's episode is the product of me gaining a much deeper grasp on a subject to which I've only previously had a fleeting understanding of. Right at the onset, I must apologize in advance. Every time I jumped into a single subject in compiling these notes, that subject became deeper and deeper the more I researched it. And the whole subject of Joseph Smith's polygamy is incredibly fascinating. As for my apology, this episode is significantly longer than initially intended. If you've enjoyed our previous clean-cut episodes and the abnormally long form structure of them, I hope you'll enjoy this episode just as much. But for those of you seeking a shorter and more digestible listening experience, this episode is broken up into 3 simple segments: the Entered Apprentice, the Fellowcraft, and the Master, with brief song intermissions marking the change from one segment to the next. Hopefully that will help with ease of consumption of the material for those of you who can't devote multiple hours in one sitting to a single episode of a single podcast, especially when there's so much good content in other feeds awaiting you. The reason I didn't break this up into separate episodes is because I wanted all of the information in one place. Joseph Smith's polygamy is a huge topic, which can't be realized or justified or completely deconstructed in one sitting. So today we're hitting the entirety of Joseph's life, skimming over the surface and stories of some of the most remarkable women who were affected by the practice of polygamy. We'll dive deeper into each of these women's stories for the historical timeline in the regular episodes. This episode merely serves as a primer to the rest of Nauvoo history intertwined with Mormon polygamy. And it lays the groundwork for the broader practice of Mormon polygamy throughout the rest of Mormon history into modern times. Without further ado, I present my personal take on Joseph Smith's free love and polygamy. Enjoy! Joseph Smith's polygamy is always a subject of Mormon history, which divides groups of people, yet entices so much fascination and study from so many angles. Beginning with the earliest efforts of Joseph Smith III, young prophet of the reorganized church, historians have been grappling with Joseph Smith's polygamy ever since the practice of it led to his untimely death. As with last episode, I'm not going to spend much time discussing what ought to spend our time more effectively in examining what simply is or has been. The Entered Apprentice. Often when we introduce the subject of Joseph Smith's polygamy, it's not long before the conversation evolves into some kind of labeling. And labeling is useful. It sums up an entire concept in a succinct word or phrase. So what labels have been thrown around about Joseph's personality and sexual profile? When most Mormons talk about polygamy, they've been instructed that polygamy was introduced for the purpose of financially and emotionally supporting widows and wives of unbelievers. There were too many women and not enough men, so the Mormon forefathers engaged in polygamy for practical purposes. One male breadwinner to feed multiple families. Others will view Joseph's practice through the eyes of piety. Joseph was getting married and sealed to multiple women to ensure their salvation. What better path to salvation than being sealed to the prophet of the restoration himself? Traditional Mormon doctrine holds that everyone must trace their spiritual connection to the prophet through some means. Modernly, when a man is given the priesthood, he's issued a card with his priesthood lineage, tracing the steps his priesthood took to get to him from Joseph Smith. Women are then sealed to the men in the temple sealing ceremony, binding that wife to the priesthood and ensuring both of their places among the Mormon family in heaven. Through this lens, Joseph was a savior polygamist, which also explains his sealings to men known as the law of adoption. Other people aren't quite so charitable. Some look at Joseph's practices as predatory. Some label his courtship of Helen Mar Kimball at the age of 14 as pedophilia, even though it's a wholly inaccurate term. Pedophilia has a strict definition and stops being the case right around the age of pubescence. Then the term ephebophilia becomes the accurate definition. And one needn't appeal to Helen Mar Kimball alone to see predatory sexual practices by the prophet, as a number of his marriages only came after incessant cajoling from authority figures, other wives, and even from Joseph himself. Some people like to take a softer, yet still critical approach on Joseph Smith's sexual and marriage practices by saying that he was a product of his time. Polygamy wasn't all that uncommon in his day and age, and we spent all of part 1 discussing just how prevalent it was leading up to 19th century American puritanical societies. These labels that we use to generalize Joseph Smith are useful for conversation purposes, but each definition is somehow lacking. The reason the labels are so compelling yet hotly disputed is there were so many examples in Joseph's 30-plus marriages that each perspective can use details from any number of those marriages to justify the specific label they're slapping onto Joseph. For this very reason, personally, I'm at pains to try and construct my own way of discussing Joseph Smith's polygamy. So much has been written, so much more has been said in dealing with the topic, and I sincerely doubt that I can contribute anything new to the discussion. But let's try a bit of a holistic approach when viewing Joseph's history with women. He was sealed to his first official Nauvoo polygamist wife, Louisa Beeman, in April of 1841, but Joseph had a long and colorful sexual history prior to that instance. Not much is known of Joseph's history before he entered the public spotlight with Mormonism in 1830. Much has been written about him after 1830, especially after his death in 1844, but his own writings prior to 1829 are limited to a few letters and very little else. Joseph's later reflections on his own life prior to Mormonism are extremely biased, but often they're the best source that we have. To properly understand Joseph's views on sexuality, we need to put his life in the context of Victorian America with heavy puritanical influences. People didn't discuss sexuality publicly. Society had some fascinating taboos on the subject as a whole, and society today is still overshadowed by the ignorance of human sexuality that was embraced by 19th century's societies and long before that. Historians are left with snatching a few catchphrases implying what was considered sexually immoral, such as vicious habits and unchristian-like conduct with women, in order to posit sexual indiscretions because these topics weren't discussed openly in the public forum. Many people will try and excuse Joseph Smith's conduct by saying he was a prophet but also a man, and therefore imperfect and subject to the same temptations as every other man. While the latter part of the statement is true, it's only due to society's perspective and the inherent hypocrisy that Joseph's conduct violates the former claim of piety. Joseph's views on sex and marriage came into conflict with society at large, which forced his dealings, which may have been deemed accessible in a different time in society as normal, into these underground clandestine enclaves of vicious whoredoms and gluttony. But Joseph was a man with attractions and vice that many men deal with in our everyday society. His views on sexuality were fluid, and we can see an evolution of what he considered temptation and vicious habits morph into divinely sanctioned laws commanded by God in order to attain exaltation. To examine the first inklings of Joseph's sexuality, we have to grant the autobiographical tendencies in the first two books of the Book of Mormon, 1st and 2nd Nephi. This is the earliest view into his life coming from his own mind, dictated to Oliver Cowdery as scribe. A number of historians have linked autobiographical tendencies to Joseph Smith's life in the Book of Mormon. Dan Vogel asserts a number of documentable analogies in the Book of Mormon to the plight of the Smith family in his book Joseph Smith, Making of a Prophet. From chapter 9, we read this, quote, "It was fitting that Joseph's book began with a family that was, in many ways, comparable to the Smith family. Both were displaced and disinherited, having left the land of their inheritance to settle in a more promising region. More importantly, both were conflicted over religion, particularly over the validity of a father's dreams. Like Joseph's father, Lehi received coded messages in dreams." Now quoting the Book of Mormon, quote, "Behold, I have dreamed a dream," or in other words, "I have seen a vision." Back to Dan. He said in 1 Nephi 8:2, "In Lehi's first dream, God appeared and warned him of Jerusalem's impending destruction, and instructed him to flee with his family into the wilderness." 1 Nephi 1:5-15. Another of his dreams is remarkably similar to Joseph Sr.'s dream of the Tree of Life, with the exception that Lehi's two oldest sons, Laman and Lemuel, refused to come with him to the tree and partake of its fruit. 1 Nephi 8. Thus, Joseph transformed his father's dream of family unity into the reality of family division. The account in the Book of Mormon is narrated by the youngest of Lehi's four sons, Nephi, who, like Joseph Smith, becomes a zealous defender of his father's dreams. Nephi's two oldest brothers, Laman and Lemuel, oppose Lehi's prophecies and ridicule his visions as the foolish imaginations of his heart, 1 Nephi 2:11. The remaining brother, Sam, joins Nephi in supporting the father. Sariah, Lehi's wife, experiences a brief period of doubt in which she complained against Lehi and derogatorily called him a visionary man. Eventually, she is convinced of the truthfulness of her husband's dreams. In Lehi's dream, she joins him at the Tree of Life, chapter 8, verse 14-16. At this point, Sariah disappears from the Book of Mormon narrative. Unlike Lehi, her death goes unreported. The parallels to the Smith family are not seen as much in direct representations as in more subtle emotional profiles. Joseph's older and younger brothers, Hiram and Samuel, are much like Laman and Lemuel, to the extent that, in Joseph's emotional language, they rebelled against the authority of Joseph Sr.'s dreams and joined the Presbyterian Church, even though, in the Book of Mormon story, both Laman and Lemuel are older than Nephi. One might see Joseph's two older siblings, Hiram and Sophronia, in the same light, the latter having also joined the Presbyterian Church. Nephi and Joseph occupied the fourth position among their siblings in their respective families, although, again, somewhat differently. Nephi was the fourth of Lehi's sons, but nothing is said concerning the order of his sisters, 2 Nephi 5, verse 6. Joseph was the fourth of Joseph Sr.'s sons, only if one includes the unnamed infant who died before Alvin's death. At the time, Joseph was the fourth of the living Smith children. One important difference exists in that Alvin died before the family became fractured. Regardless, Joseph's decision to write about a family that was seriously divided over the meaning of a patriarch's dream is significant. Then from later on in the same chapter, we read this, quote, "Unlike Joseph, Nephi is not silent about religious matters. There may be something of Joseph's feelings and attitudes about his family situation in Nephi's words and actions, emotions that Joseph may have been reluctant to express openly to his family. Nephi is closely allied with his father, Lehi, both in name and spirit. Indeed, their names have a familiar sound, just as Laman's and Lemuel's names indicate an alliance. Nephi wants to experience the same dream that his father had of the Tree of Life. Before long, he excels his father in both visions and scriptural interpretations, not only expounding the meaning of his father's vision, but adding to and, more importantly, correcting his version. He becomes a second witness to his father's gift by experiencing it himself, and not in any ambiguous terms, but in waking visions that endow his father's testimony with even greater authority. 1 Nephi 2, verse 16, 3:1, 11:1, and 15:1. End quote. So if we stick with this theme that Dan Vogel proposes, we find in the Book of Mormon the introduction of the daughters of Ishmael for the sons of Lehi to take as wives. To put the 7th chapter of 1 Nephi into context, we need to understand a little about the Smith family history. Sometime in 1825, Joseph Smith Sr. and some of his sons contracted to hunt for buried treasure with a man named Josiah Stowell. They commenced their digging operations on the Susquehanna River near what was then known as Harmony, Pennsylvania. For a short time, the treasure-digging group boarded with the Isaac Hale family, during which Joseph courted his wife-to-be, Emma Hale. The treasure-digging venture would prove fruitless, but Joseph did acquire his first wife out of the business trip, so some might say that he struck gold. From Chapter 7 of Dan Vogel's Making of a Prophet, quote, "One day, as Lucy recalled, Joseph took his parents aside to tell them his plans to marry Emma Hale, explaining that, now quoting Joseph, he had felt so lonely ever since Alvin's death that he had come to the conclusion of getting married if we had no objections. He said that he thought that no young woman that he ever was acquainted with better calculated to render the man of her choice happy than Miss Emma Hale." Back to quoting Vogel, Joseph Sr. had met Emma and was delighted by the news. He suggested that his son bring the young woman home to live with them. Lucy was especially anxious to meet for the first time the young woman her son had chosen. End quote. Joseph's mind was a fertile soil for his own real-world experiences to flourish and grow into legendary tales of great prophet heroes and dastardly fraternal archenemies. From Chapter 7 of the first book of Nephi, out of the Book of Mormon, we can possibly see a view into the competitive nature between brothers in courting the beautiful Isaac Hale daughters. Starting with verse 1, quote, "And now I would that ye might know, that after my father Lehi had made an end of prophesying concerning his seed, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto him again, saying that it was not meet for him, Lehi, that he should take his family into the wilderness alone, but that his sons should take daughters to wife, that they might raise up seed unto the Lord in the land of promise. And it came to pass that the Lord commanded him that I, Nephi, and my brethren should again return unto the land of Jerusalem, and bring down Ishmael and his sons into the wilderness." Get that? Isaac Hale, Ishmael. "And it came to pass that I, Nephi, did again with my brethren go forth into the wilderness to go up to Jerusalem. And it came to pass that we went up unto the house of Ishmael, and we did gain favor in the sight of Ishmael, insomuch that we did speak unto him the words of the Lord. And it came to pass that the Lord did soften the heart of Ishmael, and also his household, insomuch that they took their journey with us down into the wilderness to the tent of our father. And it came to pass that as we journeyed in the wilderness, behold, Laman and Lemuel, and 2 of the daughters of Ishmael, and 2 of the sons of Ishmael and their families did rebel against us, yea, against me, Nephi and Sam and their father, Ishmael and his wife and his 3 other daughters. And it came to pass in the which rebellion they were desirous to return unto the land of Jerusalem. And now I, Nephi, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, therefore I spake unto them, saying, Yea, even unto Laman and unto Lemuel, behold, ye are mine elder brethren. And how is it that ye are so hard in your hearts and so blind in your minds, that ye have need that I, your younger brother, should speak unto you, yea, and set an example for you? How is it that ye have not hearkened unto the words of the Lord? End quote. And you can check the show notes for a link to the Book of Mormon on LDS.org. After that, Nephi goes on to lecture all of those people who were rebelling. Nephi, the younger brother out of all of the brothers. Should we grant this as artistic license based on real-world scenarios that Joseph Smith experienced? We see how his older brothers reacted to his lecturing, and Nephi suffered the consequences expected of a younger brother when lecturing his stronger older brothers, who may have overreacted to put on a show for the daughters of Ishmael, or Isaac, whatever you want to say. Nephi eventually gains supernatural abilities that Joseph likely dreamed of having to hold his own against his abusive older brothers. Continuing on in the same chapter 7 of 1 Nephi with verse 16, quote, And it came to pass that when I, Nephi, had spoken these words unto my brethren, they were very angry with me. And it came to pass that they did lay their hands upon me. For behold, they were exceedingly wroth. And they did bind me with cords, for they sought to take away my life, that they might leave me in the wilderness to be devoured by wild beasts. But it came to pass that I prayed unto the Lord, saying, O Lord, according to my faith which is in thee, wilt thou deliver me from the hands of my brethren? Yea, even give me strength that I may burst these bands with which I am bound? And it came to pass that when I had said these words, behold, the bands were loosed from off my hands and feet, and I stood before my brethren and spake unto them again. And it came to pass that they were angry with me again, and sought to lay hands upon me. But behold, one of the daughters of Ishmael, yea, and also her mother, and one of the sons of Ishmael did plead with my brethren, insomuch that they did soften their hearts, and they did cease striving to take away my life. And it came to pass that they were sorrowful because of their wickedness, insomuch that they did bow down before me, and did plead with me that I would forgive them for the thing that they had done against me. And it came to pass that I did frankly forgive them all that they had done, and I did exhort them that they would pray unto the Lord their God for forgiveness. And it came to pass that they did so. And after they had done praying unto the Lord, we did again travel on our journey towards the tent of our father. End quote. One wonders if the daughter of Ishmael, which came to Nephi's rescue, reflects Emma stepping in during an altercation between brothers to maybe stop Alvin and Hiram from abusing Joseph or something. Or maybe Hiram and Samuel. I'm not sure. In a family where Joseph was less desirable than his older brothers, the competition for attention from similarly aged women must have been fierce in the Smith household. Whatever sympathy Joseph may have garnered from Emma was realized when he stole her away from the Hale home when Isaac was not present, and they subsequently eloped in South Bainbridge right across the New York border in 1827. Soon after Joseph and Emma were married, accusations arose of Joseph's infidelity. Published in Mormonism Unveiled by Eber D. Howe in 1834 was a testimony by a neighbor of the Smiths named Levi Lewis. In its entirety from Mormonism Unveiled, it reads as such, quote, Levi Lewis states that he has been acquainted with Joseph Smith Jr. and Martin Harris, and that he has heard them both say adultery was no crime. Harris said he did not blame Smith for Smith's attempt to seduce Eliza Winters, etc. Mr. Lewis says that he knows Smith to be a liar, that he saw him intoxicated at 3 different times while he was composing the Book of Mormon, and also that he has heard Smith, when driving oxen, use language of the greatest profanity. Mr. Lewis also testifies that he heard Smith say that he was as good as Jesus Christ, that it was as bad to injure him as it was to injure Jesus Christ. With regard to the plates, Smith said God had deceived him, which was the reason that he, meaning Smith, did not show them. End quote. That's from a PDF of Mormonism Unveiled hosted on fullerconsideration.com. You can check the show notes for it. This testimony by Levi Lewis was collected by Dr. Philassus Hurlbut when he was compiling the research to sell to Eber Howe for Mormonism Unveiled. Levi Lewis was biased against Joseph Smith, and Mormonism Unveiled was the first full-length anti-Mormon publication to be published. Regardless of that, we need to deal with the claim that Joseph may have had relations with Eliza Winters soon after his marriage to Emma. A quick look on fairmormon.org provides an apologist's answer to the entire affidavit. Quote, There are serious problems with these claims. It seems extraordinarily implausible that Joseph admitted that God had deceived him, and thus was not able to show the plates to anyone. Joseph insisted that he had shown the plates to people, and the 3 and 8 witnesses all published testimony to that effect. Despite apostasy and alienation from Joseph Smith, none denied that witness. The claim to have seen Joseph drunk during the translation is entertaining. If Joseph were drunk, this only makes the production of the Book of Mormon more impressive. But this sounds like little more than idle gossip, designed to bias readers against Joseph as a drunkard. A study of Joseph's letters and life from this period make it difficult to believe that Joseph would insist he was as good as Jesus Christ. Joseph's private letters reveal him to be devout, sincere, and almost painfully aware of his dependence on God. Thus, 3 of the charges that are mentioned by Van Wagner, based on Levi Lewis's testimony, are extraordinarily implausible. They are clearly efforts to simply paint Joseph in a bad light, make him into a pretend prophet who thinks he's better than Jesus, who admits to being deceived and who gets drunk. Such a portrayal would be welcome to skeptical ears. This Joseph is ridiculous, not to be taken seriously. We can now consider the claim that Martin and Joseph claimed that adultery was no crime, and that Joseph attempted the seduction of Eliza Winters. Recent work has also uncovered Eliza Winters' identity. She was a young woman at a meeting on the 1st of November 1832 in Springville Township, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. While on a preaching mission with his brother Emer, Martin Harris announced that Eliza had had a bastard child. Eliza sued Martin for slander, asking for $1,000 for the damage done to her good name, fame, behavior, and character, because his words, quote, render her infamous and scandalous among her neighbors. Martin won the suit. Eliza could not prove libel, likely because she had no good character to sully. This new information calls the Lewis affidavit into greater question. We are to believe that Martin, who risked and defended a libel suit for reproving Eliza for fornication, that thinks that adultery is no crime? Eliza clearly has no reason to like Joseph and the Mormons. Why did she not provide Hurlbut with an affidavit regarding Joseph's scandalous behavior? Around 1879, Eliza gave information to Frederick Mather for a book about early Mormonism. Why did she not provide testimony of Joseph's attempt to seduce her? It seems far more likely that Eliza was known for her low morals, and her name became associated with the Mormons in popular memory, since she had been publicly rebuked by a Mormon preacher and lost her court suit against him. When Levi Lewis was approached by Hurlbut for material critical of Joseph Smith, he likely drew on this association. End quote. That's obviously from Fair Mormon's treatment of Levi Lewis's testimony that Van Wagner had put forward in one of his articles. But that's Fair Mormon. It's the unofficial apologetics outlet for the church. I actually found a very interesting open email exchange between two of the foremost Joseph Smith and polygamy scholars, Dan Vogel and Brian Hales. And Brian Hales, of course, runs josephsmithpolygamy.org, and he works with the Joseph Smith Papers Project related to Joseph Smith's polygamy. Here is their little back and forth, and I'll even include Hales' superiority of light righteousness asserted against Dan Vogel, and Vogel's very succinct and just a perfect reply to the assertion. So it begins with Brian Hales' email to Dan Vogel about this. Quote, you may recall our discussion regarding some of your items in early Mormon document volumes, for which I give thanks for the incredible effort in compiling. Despite my brief interaction with them, I detected some pretty heavy bias. You remember the Nan Hill quote that I would argue would be categorized as dubious by an objective reviewer, but you generously assess, now quoting Vogel in early Mormon documents, the early rumors cannot be dismissed too quickly. And then there is your quote, now quoting early Mormon documents again. His, meaning Joseph Smith's, July 1830 trial in South Bainbridge included testimony accusing him of improper conduct with two of Josiah Stowell's daughters, Miriam and Rhoda. Back to what Hale was saying in the email. We've talked about how there is no testimony, only assumption. Additionally, I would add that the Eliza Winters interview, which you characterized her apparent silence on the topic as an accusation she neither confirmed nor denied, goes well beyond the statement, and I think that it is very likely that the topic did come up and Mather didn't like the answer. So just really quickly to analyze this, Brian Hales and Dan Vogel are going back and forth about the 1830 trial, which we'll discuss in a second, as well as the accusation of Eliza Winters. And in the Mather interview, there is no discussion of this, of the prior to 1830 sexual indiscretions between Eliza Winters and Joseph Smith. So Brian Hales is interpreting that Mather didn't like the answer when he asked Eliza Winters about it because Mather was opposed to Mormonism, so he didn't include her answer to his question, which Hales, I guess, is interpolating means that Eliza Winters denied that she had any relations with Joseph Smith, and Mather didn't like it, so he didn't include it in the interview. Brian Hales continues, I guess my question is whether you acknowledge any bias in these types of statements, and if you do, then are you concerned? I see biases that bring me back to my first email. Now quoting his first email, "If it turns out that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of the living God, then your labors and products may be deemed as perhaps the most sophisticated of all oppositional endeavors this planet has ever experienced." That's a very inflammatory claim. Understandably, you classify my reference to conviction as false confidence, but just to be complete, I would classify the biases in your presentations simply as darkness in the context of D&C 5024, which he quotes, "That which is of God is light, and he that receiveth light and continueth in God receiveth more light, and that light groweth brighter and brighter until the perfect day." Hales finishes with saying, "This light is quite real to me. I wrote a book on it. Do you see my feelings about light and darkness as the result of a frenzied mind or as some other form of self-deception?" Signed, Brian Hales. So Vogel, in a mere 2.5 paragraphs, absolutely and completely deals with everything that Hales is asserting about the trustability of Eliza Winters being or having any relations with Joseph Smith and the 1830 trial with the Stowell daughters, as well as this assertion that, let's just say that Brian Hales is enlightened, whereas Dan Vogel is apparently operating in darkness. This is Vogel's reply. Quote, "Regarding testimony at the 1830 trial, Joseph Smith was accused of improper conduct with Stowell's daughters, although apparently it wasn't verified by them when they testified. I believe this is implied in Joseph Smith's telling of the event, although you require it to be explicitly stated. Is it possible that your bias prevents you from seeing the very obvious context of Stowell's daughters being called to testify? Moreover, I used testimony in the sense of someone testifying, but you insisted that I produce written testimony and asserted that I was being deceptive. Again, Joseph Smith strongly implied that his accusers were hoping to extract from Stowell's daughters evidence of sexual impropriety. I insist that my interpretation is reasonable and not just an assumption. My footnote to Levi Lewis's statement about Eliza Winters mentioning her later interview and that she neither confirmed nor denied rumor is also reasonable. It's a simple statement, and readers needed to know that information. They can decide what it means. However, you give the speculation that the question was asked and left out because Mather didn't like the answer, which oddly shows both your bias and willingness to go beyond the evidence. In all honesty, I don't see why you are so concerned about these footnotes in early Mormon documents. I see them as quite normal and expected. My biography is a different matter. It was intended to be more interpretive and provocative. Your statement about what my work means in light of Joseph Smith being a true prophet or a fraud really doesn't concern me. I'm trying to be as honest and fair as I can. That's all I can do. I regard your feelings about light and darkness as just an opinion expressed in religious terminology. Regards, Dan." End quote. I'm going to spare commenting on Vogel's response to Hale's assertions of interpreting facts about Smith in light versus darkness. I'm just going to focus on the issue at hand, Eliza Winters and the Stowell daughters. There's no way to know if Joseph Smith and Eliza Winters had adulterous relations so soon after Joseph Smith's marriage to Emma Hale, but the fact that the gossip or conjecture existed says volumes about Joseph's personality and how others in the public viewed him. The secondary issue discussed by Vogel and Hales is the 1830 court appearance in which Joseph was put on the stand and asked about his possible relations with Josiah Stowell's daughters, Miriam and Rhoda. Soon after the Book of Mormon was published, Joseph traveled to meet with the family of Joseph Knight Sr. in Colesville, New York, where he had earned a mischievous reputation as a counterfeiter, a juggler, and a disturber of the peace. Joseph was arrested and tried twice in 1 week. During the second trial, the court proceedings were put on hold so the daughters of Josiah Stowell could be summoned to the witness stand in order to testify about their relations with Joseph Smith. Now I'm reading this from the Dan Vogel version of the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 65 through 66. None of this is added from original documents. This is all just included in the standard works of the History of the Church, but I just like Dan Vogel's set, so I'm going to read it from there. Quote, after a few more such attempts, the court was detained for a time in order that 2 young women, daughters of Mr. Stowell, with whom I had at times kept company, might be sent for, in order, if possible, to elicit something from them which might be made a pretext against me. The young ladies arrived and were severally examined, touching my character and conduct in general, but particularly as to my behavior towards them both in public and private, when they both bore such testimony in my favor as left my enemies without a pretext on their account. So apparently when the Stowell daughters were called to the stand, none of the people questioning them could nail them down on whether or not they actually had any relations with Joseph Smith. From later in, this is actually after the second trial. This is how Joseph sums it up. Quote, the court finding the charges against me not sustained, I was accordingly acquitted, to the great satisfaction of my friends and vexation of my enemies who were still determined upon molesting me. But through the instrumentality of my new friend, the constable, I was enabled to escape them and make my way in safety to my wife's sister's house, where I found my wife awaiting with much anxiety the issue of those ungodly proceedings, and with her in company next day arrived in safety at my own house. End quote. Joseph Smith was a bit of a pariah in many communities for his conduct. The charge specifically for which he was brought to these 2 trials was being a disorderly person in and around Colesville, New York. He had swindled Josiah Stowell out of living expenses and business contracts related to treasure digging, and some of the friends and family of Stowell weren't too pleased with Smith's conduct, and subsequently filed the suit on Stowell's behalf. Miriam and Rhoda Stowell, as well as Eliza Winters, provide some of the first examples of Smith's affinity towards intimacy beyond status quo monogamy. Whether or not he actually had these relations or any level of intimacy with these women, the public reaction sent a signal to Joseph Smith that society wouldn't accept his views on love and relationships. He would need to keep these practices hidden from the public eye if he was to enjoy free love and polygamy to its fullest extent. The first theater of Joseph Smith's polygamist operations was during the first mission trip for the early Mormons to the Lamanites living on the western border in Missouri. Joseph called brothers Oliver Cowdery, Parley P. Pratt, Ziba Peterson, and Peter Whitmer to proselyte in a revelation delivered 17th of October, 1830, which is now canonized into Doctrine and Covenants, section 28. After the missionaries had set up camp in Jackson County, Missouri, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon teamed up and converted a number of the Ohio Rigdonites to Mormonism. Subsequently, Rigdon and Smith traveled to Missouri to dedicate the plot of land as the Mormon Zion with new temple grounds. During this trip in early 1831, Joseph supposedly delivered a revelation dealing with one of his detailed instructions to the missionaries there. The actual text of this revelation didn't survive, but William Wines Phelps recounted it in 1861, 30 years after it was supposedly given. This is from josephsmithspolygamy.org, written by Brian Hales. We find his treatment of the historicity of the claimed revelation. Quote, reportedly, while they were on this mission, Joseph received a revelation relevant to polygamy. Some of the missionaries were to marry Native American women. In 1861, 30 years after the revelation was reportedly dictated, W. Phelps wrote a letter to President Young sharing the substance of the revelation. The details found in the revelation raised questions whether Phelps was actually recalling its content or was working from contemporaneous notes or from some other source. The statement is far too detailed for a 3-day-old recollection, let alone a 30-year-old one. And I actually do not agree with that assertion from Brian Hales. You'll see the substance of this seems rather similar to things that Joseph said repeatedly in Nauvoo that could have been simply recalled by W. Phelps at this time. But that's kind of beside the point. Continuing with josephsmithspolygamy.org, that Phelps would bring this to the attention of President Young so many years after it occurred is curious and appears somewhat random as well. Phelps ended his letter to President Young, writing, quote, about 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph Smith Jr. privately how we, that were mentioned in the revelation, could take wives from the natives, as we were all married men. He replied instantly in the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation. Whatever Joseph taught at that time regarding plural marriage apparently did not make much of a stir among the early saints who heard it because no other contemporaneous accounts are found. In addition, when the practice was started in Nauvoo, it appears that no one recalled it, and the prophet never referenced the incident. End quote. And I think that that ending paragraph really goes to bolster that William Hines Phelps might have just been fabricating that revelation. And it just because the wording is exact doesn't mean that he was working off of a contemporaneous source or some notes or, an actual copy of the revelation. It just means that he was recalling it the same way that Joseph discussed polygamy in Nauvoo and ascribing it to what happened in 1831. And, obviously the fact that the 1831 polygamy revelation was never discussed in, actual Nauvoo when polygamy kind of ramped up, I think that goes to show that W.W. Phelps was just fabricating this revelation. But hearkening back to the Old Testament prophets, Joseph was really able to easily justify the practice of polygamy in a way which wouldn't be offensive to those practicing it. This represents Joseph's first utterances of polygamy being sanctioned as a divine marital practice in the church, even if it was only recounted by W.W. Phelps 30 years after it happened. But it wouldn't be for another decade before Joseph began creating the ceremony and dogma surrounding the practice of polygamy in Nauvoo. However, I do find Hale's treatment of this practice to contradict something else he covers on that same page, wherein he deals with the early accusations of polygamy against the church. Quote, "Novel religious groups were common in the 1830s. Elizabeth A. Clark and Herbert Richardson observed, now quoting them, quote, 19th century America abounded in utopian societies. As many as 500 such communities may have flourished in this period. Back to Hales. Some experimented with marital and sexual practices, which focused suspicion on all of the groups. That's just a broad assertion, and that can't be verified as true. Early Latter-day Saint efforts to live the law of consecration, which sustained traditional monogamy, were misunderstood. The Evangelical Magazine and Gospel Advocate of Utica, New York, reported in their February 5, 1831 issue, quote, they, the Mormons, have all things in common and dispense with the marriage covenant. Continuing with Hales, Henry Carroll, who was in Kirtland area in 1832, recalled in 1885, it was claimed all things were common even to free love among the Mormons at Kirtland. Historian Mark Staker observed, quote, as late as 1835, Joseph was still trying to counter outside rumors that had apparently arisen as a result of the Morley family and early Mormonite confusion before his arrival in Kirtland. Back to Hale. Allegations of improprieties followed the LDS Church, including a variety of denials. Erastus Snow and Benjamin Winchester printed a plainly worded denial in 1841 in an address to the citizens of Salem and vicinity. Not quoting the address. It has been stated in public journals that we hold all things in common, or that we have a community of goods, also of wives. These charges we positively deny, for we hold no such things nor never did. The rules of the church forbid anything like unvirtuous conduct, and they are righteously enforced. End quote. There's a link to that article in the show notes. With Levi Lewis's 1833 assertion that Martin Harris and Joseph Smith considered adultery not to be a crime added to Joseph's 1831 so-called revelation that the missionaries were going to take First Nation women as wives like the prophets of old, all compounded by the fact that outside sources were claiming the Mormons were practicing free love, we can begin to construct Joseph Smith's stance on marriage as something in conflict with the puritanical Victorian status quo of strict or serial monogamy. There is little existing evidence of Joseph practicing free love or divinely sanctioned polygamy during the church's infancy in Kirtland, Ohio. The only real case we can nail down for sure is Fanny Alger. Any names of situations beyond Joseph's relationship with Alger are very challenging to substantiate. It should be noted that the effort of historians to find a substantive quote or revelation from Joseph Smith about polygamy prior to the 1843 revelation canonized as D&C 132 is an exercise in revisionist history. The people who are trying to substantiate these 1830 polygamy revelations need to have Joseph receive a revelation from God about polygamy to justify his free love relationships prior to Nauvoo for him to still fall into the category of a pious prophet living by God's will. Mormons need Joseph not to be an adulterer to fit the narrative they've constructed for him. But at the time, Joseph was having multiple affairs. I doubt he cared what historians and believing Mormons more than a century in the future would think of his actions. Joseph was obviously concerned with the perceptions of his contemporaries, which is why he hid his actions instead of flaunting free love like the Oneida Group. But this effort for Mormon apologists to substantiate a legitimate polygamy revelation prior to Fanny Alger is an exercise in futility. Call it what it is, Joseph liked sex and he didn't let Victorian monogamy constrain his actions, even if he was forced to resort to predatory practices to make that happen from time to time. Joseph's affair with Fanny Alger made waves in Kirtland. It was widely known by many people living in Kirtland, particularly the Mormon elite, and the reaction to Smith's impropriety is really well documented, even if the subtle details of the actual affair are a little bit fuzzy. Brian Hales acknowledges the existence of 5 documents substantiating Smith's affair with Fanny Alger. From josephsmithspolygamy.org, quote, 5 documents indicate that Joseph Smith may have experienced conjugal relations with his first plural wife, Fanny Alger. The earliest is from Oliver Cowdery in a private letter written January 21st, 1838. Now he's quoting that letter. I did not fail to affirm that what I had said was strictly true. A dirty, nasty, filthy scrape, with the word affair overwritten on scrape, of his and Fanny Alger's was talked over, in which I strictly declared I had never deviated from the truth on the matter. The next reference is 34 years later from William McClellan, now quoting McClellan. One night, she, meaning Emma Smith, missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story, too, was verily true. End quote. After that, Hales goes on to detail another interview by William McClellan, quoted from Wilhelm Weil, and finally an account from a first-hand witness, Benjamin Franklin Johnson, was written in 1903 that substantiated the Alger affair. Fanny Alger was living with the Smiths at the time of this incident. She was seen as basically a younger sister to Emma Smith, who had taken Alger under her wing to teach her homemaking skills beginning in 1832. Whether or not McClellan accurately reported Emma catching Joseph and Fanny in the middle of a sex act in the barn, the consequences of the affair are conclusive. Emma kicked Fanny out of the house, who subsequently moved to Indiana and married another man named Solomon Custer, who wasn't a Mormon. To find more detail on the Smith and Alger affair, we're forced to reference a second-hand account from the son of Levi Hancock named Mosiah Hancock. Mosiah offers some interesting details of the relationship between Joseph and Fanny, including the reaction of church leadership to the relationship. Corroborated by other evidence, Mosiah successfully pushes the first practice of polygamy in the church, with Joseph Smith specifically, to around 1832 or early 1833. Quote, concerning the doctrine of celestial marriage, the prophet told my father, Levi Hancock, in the days of Kirtland, that it was the will of the Lord for his servants who were faithful to step forth in that order. My father made some things known to me concerning those days, and the part he took with the prophet in trying to assist him to start the principle with a few chosen friends in those days. My father had required of me to bear testimony of these things at a proper time. As early as spring of 1832, Brother Joseph said, now supposedly quoting Joseph, quote, Brother Levi, the Lord has revealed to me that it is his will that righteous men shall take righteous women, even a plurality of wives, that a righteous race may be sent forth upon the earth preparatory to the ushering in of the millennial reign of our Redeemer. For the Lord has such a high respect for the nobles of his kingdom that he is not willing for them to come through the loins of careless people. Therefore, it behooves those who embrace the principle to pay strict attention to even the least requirement of our Heavenly Father. End quote. When we examine the details surrounding how Joseph acquired Fanny Alger as a wife, we can see some interesting patterns in archetypal form emerge, which would come strongly into play in Nauvoo polygamy. Levi Hancock was the man who supposedly performed the marriage between Joseph and Fanny, and Joseph apparently made a bargain with Levi, once again from Mosiah's recounting of the situation. And I'm actually reading this from Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness, The Plural Wives of Joseph Smith. It's a really good book. I highly recommend picking up a copy. Quote, "Therefore, Brother Joseph said," now supposedly quoting Joseph, "Brother Levi, I want to make a bargain with you. If you will get Fanny Alger for me for a wife, you may have Clarissa Reed. I love Fanny." "I will," said Father. Now back to Joseph. "Go, Brother Levi, and the Lord will prosper you," said Joseph. Father goes to the father Samuel Alger, Father's brother-in-law, and said, "Samuel, the prophet Joseph loves your daughter Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you?" Uncle Sam says, "Go and talk to the old woman about it. 'Twill be as she says." Father goes to his sister and says, "Clarisse, Brother Joseph, the prophet of the Most High God, loves Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you?" Said she, "Go and talk with Fanny. It will be all right with me." Father goes to Fanny and said, "Fanny, Brother Joseph the prophet loves you and wishes you for a wife. Will you be his wife?" "I will, Levi," she said. Father takes Fanny to Joseph and said, "Brother Joseph, I have been successful in my mission." Father gave her to Joseph, repeating the ceremony as Joseph repeated it to him. End quote. Todd Compton does a great job of unpacking everything in that account with this paragraph. Quoting Todd Compton, quote, "There is much to comment on in this extraordinary passage. Very prominent is the theme of exchange of women, which anthropologists have noted in many cultures. The polygamous marriage proposal is indirect, a remarkable combination of the romantic and the non-romantic. I love Fanny, Smith tells Hancock, yet he does not profess his love to Fanny face to face. He uses an intermediary, a male relative, to propose to her. Despite the indirection, this is entirely consistent with Smith's later method of approaching prospective plural wives in Nauvoo. For instance, his final proposal to Zina Huntington came through a male family member, her brother Dimmick. Smith also proposed to Elmira Johnson through her brother Benjamin. According to Knight family traditions, Smith himself brought a proposal from Hiram Smith to Martha McBride Knight, Joseph's plural wife at the time, asking for the hand of her daughter Elmira for Hiram. Levi Hancock received his reward. Smith sanctioned his marriage to Clarissa Reed, which took place on March 29, 1833, when she was 16 and he was 27. End quote. Now, it's likely that Fanny became pregnant with Joseph's child while living with the Smiths, which signaled to Emma that Fanny was performing services beyond just house cleaning for the prophet. According to Wilhelm Weil, quoting Chauncey Webb, quote, "Emma was furious and drove the girl, who was unable to conceal the consequences of her celestial relation with the prophet, out of her house." End quote. This child was either aborted or miscarried, or it died young, or it was raised under another name. Historians are unable to verify any of those possibilities, as documentation surrounding Fanny's life after 1837 becomes elusive and unreliable. The circumstances of Fanny's removal from Kirtland should be taken into consideration. When the public became aware of the sexual relations between Joseph and Fanny, a number of measures were taken publicly in a futile effort of damage control. The church leadership issued a statement dealing with the church's stance on marriage, titled Statement on Marriage, circa August 1835. The fourth line in the provision is most interesting for two reasons. First, it states that all contracts of marriage made before a person is baptized should be held sacred and fulfilled. And second, it declares one man can only have one wife and vice versa. This is from the josephsmithpapers.org, the Statement on Marriage, circa August 1835. Quote, "Number 4. All legal contracts of marriage made before a person is baptized into this church should be held sacred and fulfilled. Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. It is not right to persuade a woman to be baptized contrary to the will of her husband. Neither is it lawful to influence her to leave her husband. All children are bound by law to obey their parents, and to influence them to embrace any religious faith or be baptized, or leave their parents without their consent is unlawful and unjust. We believe that all persons who exercise control over their fellow beings and prevent them from embracing the truth will have to answer for that sin." End quote. Both hard tenets this proposal outlines would be contradicted later by Joseph Smith and the various church authorities in Nauvoo. Upon the introduction of polygamy in Nauvoo, Joseph took it upon himself to nullify all previous marriages. All marriages and sealings would need to be performed again to be considered valid by church officials in Nauvoo. The second provision had already been violated by Joseph Smith when this was issued, about, one man and one wife. After the dirty, nasty, filthy scrape, as Oliver Cowdery called it, with Fanny was public and in the public square, arrangements were made for Fanny's removal from town. But not before a church council was called to get to the bottom of things. The council was called. A few of the leadership saw it wise to lock Fanny up in the tower of the Kirtland Temple to ensure that her testimony would be given. Joseph Smith then petitioned Levi Hancock, father of Messiah Hancock that we're taking this from, to help him out of the jam because Joseph didn't want Fanny to take the witness stand and tell the whole church court about their sexual misdeeds. Very few considerations were given for Fanny's emotional state at this time. I mean, put yourself in her shoes. She was a mere 19 years old, had become prey for Joseph Smith's insatiable libido, and was now faced with exile from the community pending the outcome of her testimony. Locking her in a room while the council very publicly prepared the church court must have weighed very heavily on the young woman's mind. This is from Messiah Hancock's recounting of a story told to him by his father, Levi Hancock, and I'm reading this from page 36 of Todd Compton's In Sacred Loneliness. Quote, "As time progressed, the apostates thought they had a good hold on Joseph because of Fanny and some of the smart ones, confined her in an upper room of the temple, determined that the prophet should be settled according to their notions. Brother Joseph came to father and said, 'Brother Levi, what can be done?' There being a wagon and a dry goods box close by, and Joseph being strong and father active, father soon gained the windowsill, and Fanny was soon on the ground. Father mounts his horse with Fanny behind him, and although dark, they were in New Lyme, 45 miles distant. And when the worthies sent Fanny's dinner the next day, they were astonished not to be able to find her. Father by that time had returned, and his animal was in the stable." End quote. Now, this just may be Hancock family tradition, or folklore, if you want to call it that. But regardless of whether or not Fanny was actually locked up in the temple for a few days so that the brethren could hear her testimony, and Joseph told Levi Hancock to bust her out and take her out of town, this whole scenario does represent an interesting shift in Joseph's perspective about how the public would view his liberal stance on marriage and free love. He was the prophet, but he knew there were boundaries that he could cross ineloquently that the brethren wouldn't accept and that the public would decry. Moving forward, Joseph would have to be much more careful about his relationships and approach things at a more systematic level instead of just having a fling and justifying it as righteous polygamy after the fact. Joseph's next documentable relationship was with a woman who had a complicated and storied past, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan. Lucinda was the widow of a man named William Morgan. William Morgan had become a member of the Masonic Lodge in New York in an effort to expose the secret Masonic ceremonies. He ascended the 3 degrees over a number of years, and he finally wrote his exposé to be published in 1826. When word got out that William Morgan had written this booklet and sent it to the printers for publishing, a group of Masons kidnapped him and likely killed him, which fueled the anti-Masonic fervor of the late 1820s. This was also during Andrew Jackson's heated presidential campaign, and he was a Mason as well, so the public perception of Masons was quickly degrading to viewing them as a clandestine mafia or something like that. The printer ended up publishing William Morgan's book with a strong foreword about the death of William Morgan in the following year of 1827, which revitalized the anti-Masonic tensions in the burned-over district and all of New England, casting Lucinda Pendleton Morgan into the public spotlight once again. After William's death, Lucinda married a family of the Friend, George Washington Harris, and they both converted to Mormonism around October or November of 1834. George W. Harris quickly climbed the ranks to being a trusted Mormon elite, and by early 1838, he and Lucinda were living in Missouri, set to receive the Prophet and Sidney Rigdon after their midnight flight from Kirtland. This is from page 49 of Compton's In Sacred Loneliness. Quote, "The saints in Zion organized to give their prophet a proper welcome. On February 24th, George W. Harris, Edward Partridge, and Isaac Morley were appointed to meet Smith and Sidney Rigdon with wagons and financial aid. And when Joseph and Emma arrived at Far West on March 14th, Smith wrote, quote, 'We were immediately received under the hospitable roof of George W. Harris, who treated us with all kindness possible. Here we refreshed ourselves with much satisfaction after our long and tedious journey. They stayed with the Harrises for some 2 months, then moved to their own house. There is no firm date for Smith's marriage to Lucinda, but these 2 months are a good possibility. He often married women while he was living in the same house with them, and the Sarah Pratt statement correlates with the year 1838 as well. Smith was 32 at the time, and Lucinda was 36, so he was the first of her husbands who was not an older man. George W. Harris may have given permission for the marriage, since he was a close friend of Smith and a church leader. He later stood proxy for Smith in the Nauvoo Temple as his wife was sealed to the dead prophet for eternity. Despite the prophet's connection to Lucinda, she would not stop living with George, as was customary in Smith's polyandrous marriages." End quote. A lot of mystery surrounds Joseph and Lucinda Pendleton's relationship, which has later been called a marriage, but there's no way to know if they were actually married. Joseph had learned from the public outcry with the Fanny incident, which was one of many factors that removed him from Kirtland and forced him and the church to move to Missouri. He needed to keep his relations with women other than Emma secretive. This marks a significant issue with any relations that Joseph may have had before and after Lucinda prior to 1841. The public outcry was enough to get Joseph chased from town to town from just one rumor, probably based in truth. Seeing the tenor of his relationships really makes a person wonder what intimacy Joseph had that can't and never will be documented. This is a recurring issue with so many of his polygamist relationships. Prior to celestial marriages being documented in 1841, Joseph didn't exactly include passages in his journal of his various affairs prior to polygamy being accepted practice among the elites. We don't see entries so blatant as to say something like, "Went to Hiram, Ohio, bedded Miranda Nancy Johnson, mob took me out of the house and tarred and feathered me," or something like that. And historians wouldn't expect to find much information such as this written down. Documenting every woman Joseph ever had any relationship with, even non-sexual, becomes a challenging exercise with which hundreds of historians have wrestled for over a century. The Fellowcraft. Why don't we go ahead and take this opportunity to discuss Hiram, Ohio and Miranda Nancy Johnson for just a minute. When Joseph first moved to Ohio, he began living on the Isaac Morley farm for a very brief stint. After that, around late 1831, he moved to the Johnson home, a few miles from Kirtland in Hiram, Ohio. He and Emma spent a couple of years living in one of the bedrooms of this mansion. Even by modern standards, the house is absolutely huge. Joseph and Rigdon were translating the Bible at this time during dozens of seance-like sessions with a number of the brethren. In what Mormon apologists will claim was response to this blasphemy, an anti-Joseph mob formed and dragged Joseph and Rigdon from their homes, beat them, tarred and feathered them, and just generally abused them. Among the details often lost is the fact that the mob wanted to remove Joseph's testicles. Hardly explicable with the reasoning of the mob angry about him and Rigdon merely rewriting the Bible. This is from page 231 of Todd Compton's book. Quote, Miranda described the event, now quoting Miranda Johnson. A mob disguising themselves as black men gathered and burst into Joseph's sleeping apartment one night and dragged him from the bed where he was nursing a sick child. They also went to the house of Elder Rigdon and took him out with Joseph into an orchard, where, after choking and beating them, they tarred and feathered them and left them nearly dead. Back to Compton. According to Luke Johnson, Smith was stretched out on a board. They then tore off the few night clothes that he had on for the purpose of emasculating him, and had Dr. Dennison there to perform the operation. But when the doctor saw the prophet stripped and stretched out on the plank, his heart failed him and he refused to operate. The motivation for this mobbing has been debated. Clark Braden, a late antagonistic second-hand witness, alleged in a polemic public debate that Miranda's brother Eli led a mob against Smith because the prophet had been too intimate with Miranda, age 16. This tradition suggests that Smith may have married Miranda at this early time. Married, obviously, is a euphemism for just having sexual relations. And some circumstantial factors support such a possibility. The castration attempt might be taken as evidence that the mob felt that Joseph had committed a sexual impropriety. Since the attempt is reported by Luke Johnson, there is no good reason to doubt it. Also, they had planned the operation in advance, as they brought along a doctor to perform it. The first revelations on polygamy had been received in 1831 by historian Daniel Bachman, stating, also, Joseph Smith did tend to marry women who had stayed at his house or in whose house he had stayed, end quote. Compton goes on to discuss alternate theories to explain the mobbing and the problem with Clark Braden's secondhand account, but I find this explanation for the castration attempt to be sound reasoning, and we can leave it there. It should be noted that Miranda would later marry Orson Hyde, and Joseph would marry her in Nauvoo while Hyde was on his mission to Israel in 1841 to 43. Joseph having relations with teenagers before the legal age of consent seems to be a bit of a recurring theme. Ephebophilia. Another example of his magnetism and appeal to and for younger women is captured in another of Joseph's wives-to-be when he met her in Kirtland, Mary Elizabeth Rollins. The Rollins family attended the first preaching meetings in Kirtland by Oliver Cowdery and his ilk as they were making their way for Missouri in late 1830. The Mormon preachers thoroughly enticed the Rollins family, and Mary specifically, who was 12 years old at the time. They were baptized by Parley P. Pratt after Mary had borrowed Isaac Morley's copy of the Book of Mormon and was captivated by its words. Once Joseph made his way to Kirtland in very early 1831, he met the Morleys and everybody living nearby or on the Morley farm. Mary was one of the people in attendance, and her record survives of the first time that she met Joseph Smith. This is from Compton's In Sacred Loneliness, beginning page 207. Quote, later, in early February 1831, Joseph moved to Kirtland and visited the Gilbert home, where he was surprised to see the copy of the Book of Mormon, still rare in Ohio. Newell Whitney told him the story of Mary's intense desire to read it, and Smith asked to meet this young woman. Mary wrote, quote, I was sent for. When he saw me, he looked at me so earnestly, I felt almost afraid, and I thought he can read my every thought, and I thought how blue his eyes were. After a moment or two, he came and put his hands on my head and gave me a great blessing, the first I ever received, and made me a present of the book. He gave her the Book of Mormon. A few evenings later, she visited the Smith house with her mother and attended a meeting Joseph had organized. Mary sat on a plank resting on boxes. After prayer and singing, Smith talked, then suddenly stopped. Now back to quoting from Mary, quote, and his countenance shone and seemed almost transparent. It seems as though the solemnity of eternity rested upon all of us. He seemed almost transfixed. He was looking ahead, and his face outshone the candle which was on the shelf just behind him. I thought I could almost see the cheekbones. He looked as though a searchlight was inside his face and shining through every pore. I could not take my eyes from his face. Back to Compton. Later, she reported that Smith's words and appearance at this time were photographed on her brain. She regarded this as the first time she was sealed to the Mormon prophet, though she was sealed up to eternal life by being given to Smith, their advocate with Jesus, along with the rest of the small congregation. Only later would seal come to mean marry or link in Mormon theology. End quote. Mary was still 12 years old at this time, okay? It should be noted that during many of these meetings on the Morley farm, they partook of the sacrament in their various religious ceremonies among singing and praying and other practices. If the Smith entheogen theory holds and Joseph was spiking the sacrament with psychoactives, this was when Joseph was still tuning in the dose set and setting on the Morley farm for the perfect spiritual experience. It's understandable that this 12-year-old girl's first experience with a charismatic spiritual leader like Joseph, while everybody in the room was hopped up on entheogens, was a memorable experience for her, explaining why it was photographed on her mind from such an early age, and possibly explaining why she was seeing Joseph's face as light. During that same meeting, Martin Harris was groveling on the floor at the feet of the prophet when Joseph told everybody that the Savior had been walking among them and that Joseph had communed face to face with Jesus. Powerful assertions, right? But everybody in the room was feeling the Spirit, and likely they were in a highly suggestible state of mind, and the pale countenance of the prophet was likely just as vivid for most of the people in the room. This experience is perfectly consistent with what we'd expect of consecrated sacrament. But Mary Elizabeth Rollins' account does an incredible service to historians. It documents a trend in Joseph's sexual practices. From the time they first met, Mary held a certain reverence and affinity for the prophet, and, him being in his, authority position. And it seems that he was drawn to her in her, early pubescent phase. As she matured into womanhood, Joseph would seem to never take his eyes off of Mary, which really seems to strike some, predatory tones. Joseph would later tell Mary that he was commanded in 1834 to take her as a wife, but couldn't as she was living in Missouri, 1,000 miles away from Kirtland where he was living. She soon married a young man aged 25 when she was 17, named Adam Leitner. That's a non-Mormon from Pennsylvania. Mary continued to keep the idea of being married or sealed to the prophet in her mind, and finally, in early 1842, he proposed to take her as his polygamous wife. From page 211 of Compton's book, quote, "By Mary's own account, she had had spiritual presentiments that she would become Joseph Smith's wife." Quoting Mary, "I had been dreaming for a number of years I was his wife. I thought I was a great sinner. I prayed to God to take it away from me." Back to Compton. "However, the prophetic dreams were fulfilled. Smith proposed to her in early February 1842 at the home of Newell and Elizabeth Whitney. In her later life, she retold the story a number of times, which allows us to construct a fascinating, detailed composite account showing how Smith approached his prospective wives. First, after he introduced the idea of plural marriage to Mary, he told her that God had instructed him to marry her in 1834, but he had been in Kirtland and she in Missouri. He said that he had been frightened of the idea at first, but, he said, as Mary remembered it, "The angel came to me 3 times between the year 1834 and 42 and said I was to obey that principle or he would lay or destroy me. Then he made an important statement." Now, quoting Mary, "Joseph said I was his before I came here, and he said all the devils in hell should never get me from him." In her autobiography, Mary wrote that Smith told her, "I was created for him before the foundation of the earth was laid." So we have the doctrine of spirits matched in the pre-existence, a concept that gives important insight into Smith's practice of polyandry. It fits him into the context of the broader spiritual wife doctrine in the burned-over district, in which spiritual affinities between a man and woman took precedence over legal but non-sacral marriage. Perhaps the Mormon doctrine of the pre-existence derived in part from this influence. Smith also told Mary, now quoting Mary again, "I know that I shall be saved in the kingdom of God. I have the oath of God upon it, and God cannot lie. All he gives me I shall take with me, for I have the authority and that power conferred upon me." Back to Compton. In other words, Smith linked plural marriage with salvation, as he did in later marriages. If Mary accepted him as her husband, her place in heaven would be assured. End quote. There are a few interesting patterns to tease out of Joseph's relationship with Mary. First off, he'd primed her to be open to the concept of plural marriage during her formative teenage years. He told her while in Nauvoo that he'd been commanded by an angel to take her to wife years before he had the courage to approach her, which coincided closely with when they first met. One skill that Joseph had acquired through his early years was the ability to read people through body language and simple mannerisms. From the way Mary's recounting is structured, it seems like she was attracted to Joseph from the time she was coming into early womanhood, likely giving subconscious body language signals upon which Joseph was capable of picking up and capitalizing. Once Joseph decided to pursue Mary with a little bit more earnest, he fabricated the claim that she was his in the pre-existence before they came to earth. She was made specifically for him. This likely gave spiritual explanation for the chemistry that they shared and probably made Mary a little more open-minded to the prospect of continuing to be married to Adam Leitner while being sealed to the prophet for eternity where marriage really matters. Finally, the cherry on top, Joseph told her that any woman who marries him, her place in heaven would be assured. The reason people follow a prophet is to gain eternal salvation. When the prophet provides a direct path to that salvation through marriage to him, that's a hard bargain to ignore, even if the requirement comes into conflict with the Victorian-era puritanical views on sexuality and marriage. Mary toiled with the proposition for some time. And Compton does a great job of deconstructing this. Quote, "She did not agree to the marriage at first. She was married to and presumably in love with another man and was skeptical of Smith's doctrine. She asked why, if an angel came to him, it had not appeared to her. She asked pointedly, wasn't it possible that the angel was from the devil? Smith assured her that it had come from God. She replied that she would never be sealed to him until she had a direct witness from God. He told her to pray earnestly, for the angel had told him that she would have a witness. As the conversation ended, he asked her if she would turn traitor and speak of this to anyone. She replied, I shall never tell a mortal I had such a talk from a married man. She was understandably troubled by this proposal. Nevertheless, she prayed about it and discussed it with the only person Smith would allow her to confide in, Brigham Young. One day she knelt between 3 haystacks and she wrote, If ever a poor mortal prayed, I did. She even prayed with her hands upraised, following the pattern of Moses. A few nights after that, she was in her bedroom where her mother and aunt also slept. When, she later recounted, a personage stood in front of the bed looking at me. Its clothes were whiter than anything I had ever seen. I could look at its person, but when I saw its face so bright and more beautiful than any earthly being could be, and those eyes piercing through and through, I could not endure it. It seemed as if I must die with fear. I fell back in bed and covered up my head. As she hid under the covers, her aunt awoke and saw a figure in white robes pass from our bed to my mother's bed and pass out of the window." End quote. Let's take a few minutes to discuss Joseph and Mary's relationship here. Joseph had picked up signals that Mary could be one of his victims for years by this point in Nauvoo. He told her that he'd been commanded by an angel to marry her, and that if she were righteous enough through prayer and fasting and supplication, that she would gain the same confirmation. Mary was under a lot of stress with this proposition, and, maybe other things that were going on in her life. It's kind of hard to know. And after days of contemplating and toiling over Joseph's proposition, she finally had a psychological break, and her mind constructed what she most wanted while she was in a sleep-deprived and drowsy state of mind. She would later approach Joseph with this story, and he would claim it as the confirmation that she sought, and supposedly prophesied other things which would befall Mary's family, which she claims all came true. After years of grooming this impressionable teenage woman and a few weeks of intense pursuit and constant bombardment of sexual advances, Joseph finally collected his prize, and Mary was married to Joseph at the end of February 1842. Of Joseph's many wives, examples like what Mary experienced exhibit what can easily be classified as sexual predation. The term sexual grooming is very loaded, and it holds significant weight and explanatory power in modern psychology. I found an article on Allure which discusses the allegations of sexual abuse perpetrated by music artist R. Kelly, but it also exhibits some incredibly relevant information about the process behind grooming. The article cites clinical and forensic sexologist Eric Marlowe Garrison, who's made sexual grooming one of his main focuses of study. You'll find a link to the article in the show notes. Quote, "Grooming is the slow, methodical, and intentional process of manipulating a person to the point where they can be victimized," Eric Marlowe Garrison, a sex counselor and author, tells Allure. "After the perpetrators find their targets, they then gain trust and move in from there." End quote. And here are just a few relevant extracts from the article, and it lists 7 details of sexual grooming people should know about. Number 1, anyone can be a victim. And each of these numbers have a sub explanation below them. So, number 1, anyone can be a victim. No one is immune to grooming, though some are more susceptible than others, including minors, because of their naivete, Marlowe Garrison says. Grooming can occur at any age, and it has a great deal to do with gullibility, insecurity, religion, and culture. It starts by targeting a vulnerable person, then building trust. Number 2, it often starts with friendship. Groomers don't jump right into abuse, which is often sexual. They begin with building a friendship. It'll be in a way where they get to know the victim well enough, where they find out what they like. Don Michael, PhD, a sexuality counselor, tells Allure. Let's say somebody is on Snapchat or Instagram. The offender can pick up some of the things that the victim is posting. That's why, especially for young teens or even young adults, they have to be aware of the information they're putting out there, because someone can get this information and use it to befriend them. And that's kind of how it starts. Number 3, perpetrators use favors and promises to build trust. Initial friendliness typically encourages the victim to let down their guard and think of the perpetrator as a mentor, benefactor, romantic interest, or friend. And then, once the victim's guard is down, the perpetrator will do them a favor, Michael says. They'll do something for the victim so that the person feels indebted to them to a certain extent. Number 4, secrecy is a common characteristic of grooming. Typically, groomers try to keep relationships with victims extremely private from the beginning. Marlowe Garrison says, secrecy is developed early on for non-sexual aspects of the relationship. In his beach glass example, for instance, he says the groomer might say, "Let's not tell anyone where you got the beach glass because I have only but so much of it. If others find out about it, there won't be any left for your growing collection." Excuses for keeping interactions private can make victims feel flattered and special, and therefore inclined to keep these interactions secret. Number 5, grooming can be difficult to distinguish from romance. The slow process of building trust and establishing secrecy as normal can make it hard for both victims and victims' acquaintances to recognize grooming for what it is. If you feel you may be that victim or that someone you know is, one thing to look out for is an insistence to meet on the part of the groomer, Marlowe Garrison says. Groomers are spending a lot of time and money on building that relationship, and they can see their progress through meetings. Groomers' desire to see their victim exceeds the excitement that might be expected of someone in a new romantic relationship and crosses over into guilting and threats. Number 6, victims can get out. And number 7, family members and friends can help, but it's important for them to tread carefully. End quote. The entire article is fascinating. Please chase the show notes and give it a read. But let's examine the high points of Mary and Joseph's relationship to see if we can check any of those boxes. Number 1, minors are specifically susceptible to grooming due to their naivete. Mary was 12 and Joseph was 26 when they first met, and their relationship developed from there. Number 2, it all starts with friendship. Joseph didn't propose to her when he first met Mary. He paid his dues to become her friend over more than a decade before he proposed, exhibiting that Joseph was in it for the long haul. Number 3, using promises and favors to build trust. The very first thing Joseph did was give a Book of Mormon to Mary when she felt that she wasn't worthy to have her own copy. What started as an indirect gift, Mary likely saw as a great favor to her from a prophet of God, an authority figure, a gift which was her ticket to eternal salvation. What greater gift can a person give than salvation in the form of a Book of Mormon, which also came into play when Joseph promised her that his wives would have their seat reserved in the celestial kingdom? Number 4, secrecy. Obviously, Joseph swore Mary to secrecy, and she was only able to speak to Brigham Young, Joseph's wingman, about the proposition that Joseph was making. Keeping his proposition secret was necessary for so many obvious reasons, which Mary seemed to uphold. Number 5, grooming is difficult to distinguish from romance. Joseph's claims to divinity were hard to distinguish from reality when the majority of people around him hung onto every word which spewed from his mouth as if it came straight from the mouth of God. Any subconscious grooming Joseph was putting Mary through had the veneer of divinity, even though it could likely be ascribed to sexual predation when we look back at all of the details in aggregate. Number 6, the victims can get out. Now, this may or may not have been true for Mary, had she ever realized Joseph's real intentions and her own status as a victim of grooming. Instead, she didn't, and she became the widow of an unwilling martyr before she came of any reasonable age to discover whether or not she was deceived by Joseph. Joseph Smith was immortalized as her ticket to exaltation, and I doubt that she ever put extra thought into whether or not she had been a victim of primal sexual predation. All in all, the example of Mary Rowland's relationship to Joseph ticks every one of the boxes linked to signs of sexual grooming, a powerful yet subtle sexual predatory practice. Where this becomes increasingly more insidious is when we examine number 7 on the list. family members and friends can help, but it's important for them to tread carefully. The problem was, Nauvoo was utterly spellbound to Joseph Smith as their pipeline to divinity. When anybody identified his sexual indiscretions and predatory abuse, they were quickly cut off from the society, or they were treated as lesser to some extent. William Marks and Sidney Rigdon provide great examples of what happened when members of the elite were opposed to polygamy. One was nearly assassinated, the other was essentially cut off from all church affairs and begrudged by Joseph Smith for the rest of his life. Such were the consequences of trusted elites when they opposed polygamy. What would have happened if Adam Leitner, the non-Mormon husband of Mary, would have spoken up about what was going on? Even if he didn't publicly speak out about it, how would that conversation go with his wife in private? I mean, he may have approached Mary and said that he was suspicious of Joseph Smith and didn't agree with the relationship situation, but would Mary be willing to listen? Or would her damaged psyche from years of grooming and some mix of divine Stockholm syndrome cause her to oppose any rational conversation on the topic? The way we introduce this conversation today is by proposing some labels that fit Joseph Smith's sexual profile. Of his dozens of wives, many examples can be cherry-picked to exhibit every label we proposed, and this example with Mary fits the bill of Joseph Smith being a sexual predator, very well practiced, trending towards serial ephebophilia. Look, I'm all for consenting adults engaging in whatever sexual relationship, situation, or practice which makes them happy. If you tried to pin Mary down on her relationship with Joseph, she may very well claim that she was fully informed in the situation and she was making the decision of her own free will. But parsing truly informed and actual consent out of a one-sided sexual relationship that was a product of years of grooming and sexual predation, with the divinity of a prophet being an authority figure all tied up into it, that's not a simple task. But the situation definitely doesn't fit in the criteria of informed and consensual. For many of his polygamous relationships, Joseph Smith was a sexual predator, and there's no way to get around that fact. It's not fake news, it's not anti-Mormon propaganda, it's not cherry-picking facts to substantiate a false claim. Joseph Smith preyed on unsuspecting young women at impressionable times in their lives, and swore them to secrecy when he would propose. Any court would look at this verifiable historical evidence and convict Joseph Smith for sex abuse, and today, Joseph would be a registered sex offender. That's the real human being behind who Mormons claim to be their prophet of God. Consistent with Joseph's sexual predation was an example of another one of his wives, the youngest of all that he married. And I'm going to start by reading this from the Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo article on LDS.org. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. Quote, "Most of those sealed to Joseph Smith were between 20 and 40 years of age at the time of their sealing to him. The oldest, Fanny Young, was 56 years old. The youngest was Helen Mar Kimball, daughter of Joseph's close friends Heber C. and Violet Murray Kimball, who was sealed to Joseph several months before her 15th birthday. Marriage at such an age, inappropriate by today's standards, was legal in that era, and some women married in their mid-teens. Helen Mar Kimball spoke of her sealing to Joseph as being for eternity alone, suggesting that the relationship did not involve sexual relations." End quote. Historians have taken issue with the wording in much of this Gospel Topics essay, not least of which is the wording surrounding Helen Mar Kimball marrying Joseph, quote, "several months before her 15th birthday," end quote. Guys, she was 14. Just tell it how it is. 7 months shy of 15 is actually closer to 14 than it is to 15. Another issue with this LDS.org essay is that it seems to paint a picture that teen marriages were common practice in the early to mid-1800s, which just isn't true. The average age for marriage was 22 for women and 21 for men throughout most of the 19th century. Teen marriages weren't forbidden, but they certainly weren't average by any stretch of imagination. It should have said marriage at such an age inappropriate by today and 19th century standards was legal in that era. That's a correct statement. Another point to take issue with, Helen Kimball called her marriage to Joseph as for eternity alone. Church historians have taken this as a keyword exhibiting that she wasn't sexually involved and that the marriage was only performed for the sake of sealing Helen to Joseph in the eternities. I think this is an extremely generous interpretation and doesn't explain why so much of Helen's decision to marry Joseph was heavily laden with nothing but dread and loathing. However, Joseph did die before she was 16 years old, so he may have kept his hands off of her. There's really no way to know, but just painting that when they were sealed for eternity alone means unequivocally that there was no sex involved, I think that's a little too generous with the historical record. But luckily for historians, Helen Kimball was a prolific writer and autobiographer. She frequently kept journals, and in spite of her fundamental disagreements with the practice of polygamy, she would later become a public advocate for its legal practice in Utah, publishing 2 pamphlets in the 1880s defending the practice of polygamy. Helen is one of the better documented examples of Joseph's polygamy. Without going through the entirety of Helen Kimball's relationship with Joseph, suffice it to say she wasn't so ecstatic about the situation. Joseph initially propositioned Violet and Heber Kimball for him to take Violet as one of his wives, to which the Kimballs reluctantly agreed. When Heber and Violet approached the prophet and agreed to the marriage, Joseph said that it was merely a test and that they passed, so he wouldn't actually take Violet for a wife. Instead, he wanted to take their 14-year-old daughter, Helen, for a wife. As we progress through our timeline, when this interaction happens between Joseph and the Kimballs, we'll discuss it in much greater detail, but for now, the conversation can function by understanding that Helen is yet one more example of Joseph Smith's sexual prey, regardless of whether or not they actually share physical intimacy. One aspect of polygamy in Nauvoo we can't ignore is how much it permeated the top echelons of Mormon leadership. It wasn't just Joseph Smith. Gone were the days of Kirtland and Missouri polygamy, where Joseph was going at it with cavalier disregard for the destruction left in its wake. He needed other trusted people in leadership positions on his side for the doctrine to be accepted and widely practiced at a systemic level. Brigham Young and Heber Kimball were some of Joseph's greatest allies and wingmen when it came to acquiring more wives, and Joseph was happy to return the favor when situations would arise. There was a family of recent European immigrant converts when Brigham wanted to take the 17-year-old Martha Brotherton for his wife. Brigham had converted the Brotherton family during his mission in Europe over 1840 to 42, and had undoubtedly cultivated an attraction to young Martha during his time there. Martha was unsuspectingly ambushed by the 3 molesketeers, Joseph Smith, Heber Kimball, and Brigham Young, in the upper story of the red brick store. They locked Martha in a room with Brigham and later brought in Joseph to drive the marriage proposition home. Martha refused and subsequently went home and recorded the incident, which was included as an affidavit in John C. Bennett's expose of polygamy. I'll let you, the listener, judge everything about this scenario for yourself, because H. Michael Marquardt painstakingly reconstructed the interactions in his book Rise of Mormonism, from which I am reading this beginning on page 563. Quote, "Going upstairs with Heber C. Kimball to the second floor of the red brick store, she, Martha, found Brigham Young and Joseph Smith alone. Martha was introduced to the prophet Joseph Smith by Brigham Young. Joseph offered Martha his seat, after which Smith and Heber Kimball left the room, leaving Martha alone with Apostle Young. Brigham Young arose, locked the door, closed the window, and drew the curtain. He then came and sat before Martha Brotherton. The following is based on her memory of what took place that day."
"This is our private room, Martha."
"Indeed it is, sir. I must be highly honored to be permitted to enter it."
"Sister Martha, I want to ask you a few questions. Will you answer them?"
"Yes, sir."
"And will you promise not to mention them to anyone?"
"If it is your desire, sir, I will not."
"And you will not think any the worse of me for it, will you, Martha?"
"No, sir."
"Well, what are your feelings toward me?"
"My feelings are just the same towards you as they ever were, sir."
"But to come to the point more closely, have not you an affection for me that, were it lawful and right, you could accept of me for your husband and companion?"
"If it was lawful and right, perhaps I might, but you know, sir, it is not."
"Well, Brother Joseph has had a revelation from God that it is lawful and right for a man to have 2 wives. For as it was in the days of Abraham, so shall it be in these days. And whoever is the first that is willing to take up the cross will receive the greatest blessings. And if you will accept of me, I will take you straight to the celestial kingdom. And if you will have me in this world, I will have you in that which is to come. And Brother Joseph will marry us here today. And you can come home this evening and your parents will not know anything about it.
Sir, I should not like to do anything of the kind without the permission of my parents.
Well, you are of age, are you not?
No, sir, I shall not be until the 24th of May.
Well, that does not make any difference. You'll be of age before they know, and you need not fear. If you will take my counsel, it will be well with you, for I know it to be right before God, and if there is any sin in it, I will answer for it. But Brother Joseph wishes to have some talk with you on the subject. He will explain things. Will you hear him?
I do not mind.
Well, I want you to say something.
I want time to think about it.
Well, I will have my kiss anyhow.
After that, Brigham brought Joseph in as the wingman to seal the deal, and Brigham said this to Joseph.
Well, Sister Martha would be willing if she knew it was lawful and right before God.
Well, Martha, it is lawful and right before God. I know it is. Look here, don't you believe in me? Well, Martha, just go ahead and do as Brigham wants you to. He is the best man in the world except me.
Oh, then you are as good?
Yes.
Well, we believe Joseph to be a prophet. I have known him near 8 years and always found him the same.
Yes, and I know that this is lawful and right before God. And if there is any sin in it, I will answer for it before God. And I have the keys of the kingdom. And whatever I bind on earth is bound in heaven. And whatever I loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And if you will accept of Brigham, you shall be blessed. God shall bless you, and my blessings shall rest upon you. And if you will be led by him, you will do well. For I know Brigham will take good care of you. And if he don't do his duty to you, come to me, and I will make him. And if you do not like it in a month or two, come to me, and I will make you free again. And if he turns you off, I will take you on.
Sir, it will be too late to think in a month or two after. I want time to think first.
Well, the old proverb is, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And it would be the greatest blessing that has ever been bestowed upon you.
Yes, and you will never have reason to repent it. That is, if I do not turn from righteousness. And that I trust I never shall. For I believe in God, who has kept me so long will continue to keep me faithful. Did you ever see me act in any way wrong in England, Martha?
No, sir.
No, neither can anyone else lay anything to my charge.
Well, then, what are you afraid of? Come, let me do the business for you.
Sir, do let me have a little time to think about it, and I will promise not to mention it to anyone.
Well, look here, you know a fellow never will be damned for doing the best he knows how.
Well then, the best way I know of is to go home and think and pray about it.
Well, I shall leave it with Brother Joseph whether it would be best for you to have time or not.
Well, I see no harm in her having time to think, if she will not fall into temptation.
Oh, sir, there is no fear of my falling into temptation.
Well, you must promise me you will never mention it to anyone.
I do promise.
Well, you must promise me the same.
I promise.
Well, that will do. That is the principle we go upon. I think I can trust you, Martha.
Yes, I think you ought.
She looks as if she could keep a secret. Personally, I find that whole situation profoundly uncomfortable and disturbing and just wrong in every possible way. But I'll let you judge it and the people who put Martha in that situation for yourself. To claim all of Joseph's polygamous relations were the product of his sexual predation would be wholly inaccurate. We can paint a picture of Joseph as a sexual predator with a number of examples, but other examples exist among Joseph's harem that exhibit women who seemed informed and consensual in practicing free love with the prophet and merely calling it marriage for the sake of public perceptions. Truly, one of Joseph's most fascinating wives was Eliza R. Snow, sister of the fourth prophet of the Brighamite Church, Lorenzo. Eliza was a poet, born in 1804, and stands heads and shoulders above her contemporaries as being incredibly bright and witty. She was also a powerful feminist and female's ally in Nauvoo and especially in Utah. She was made the first secretary of the 1842 Relief Society and would go on to have a very colorful life in various leadership positions throughout Utah, even dabbling in politics from time to time. Eliza Snow didn't seem particularly interested in having a relationship during early womanhood. From page 308 of Compton's book, in chapter 13, all about Eliza Roxy Snow, we read this, quote, "Her later friend, Patty Sessions, married when she was 17, but Eliza, despite many opportunities for romance, remained single. Perhaps potential suitors were intimidated by her educated, strong-minded intelligence. Wells wrote, quote, "Many of her friends were extremely anxious to see her well settled in life, but she was happy in herself and would not submit to any interference in this matter." Back to Compton. "She stands apart from nearly all of Joseph's wives in this respect, as she might have been a spinster if Smith had not married her. And despite her marriages to Smith and Brigham Young, she raised no children." End quote. Another example that Compton includes of Eliza's intelligence was during the Snow's family exodus from Missouri to Illinois in December of 1838, when Eliza was confronted by a member of the Missouri State Militia who was overseeing the Mormon exodus and, rode up on horseback while the Mormons were trudging through the snow and, probably laughing at them and whatnot. From Compton, quote, "The Snows, with a company of 75, left Adam-on-Diamond on December 10th in the bitter cold of winter. As they traveled, Eliza had an encounter with one of the so-called militia that gives us an example of her sharp, ironic wit. He greeted her. 'Well, I think this will cure you of your faith.' Looking him squarely in the eye, I replied, 'No, sir, it will take more than this to cure me of my faith.' His countenance dropped, and he responded, 'I must confess you are a better soldier than I am.' I passed on, thinking that, unless he was above the average of his fellows in that section, I was not complimented by his confession." End quote. Witty. I love Eliza Snow. When Eliza first heard of rumors of polygamy, she claimed it was a repulsive concept to her, but once she was introduced, she really started liking the lifestyle and how much it plugged her into the Mormon elite society. From page 312 of Compton's In Sacred Loneliness, I think this paragraph drives home the point that not all of Joseph's wives were averse to the new doctrine, or were acquired through means of sexual predation. Quote, "But Eliza's conversion to the practice of polygamy would go one step further." Quoting Eliza, "As I increased in knowledge concerning the principle and design of plural marriage, I grew in love with it, and today esteem it a precious, sacred principle, necessary to the elevation and salvation of the human family, in redeeming women from the curse and the world from corruption." End quote. Eliza would later say in an interview that Emma Smith had authorized the marriage and that Eliza and Joseph's relationship had a sexual dimension. For the sake of brevity, Eliza's story is one that needs to be unpacked, but we're not going to take the opportunity to do so today. Instead, I'm going to have a guest on in the future to discuss Eliza. For now, we can rest assured that Eliza was a proponent of polygamy once she was fully introduced to the concept, and would later be employed as an emissary for Joseph Smith to proposition other prospective wives. That's one salacious aspect to point out here. Joseph did use his harem of wives to accomplish his ends. He convinced some of his wives to manipulate other women that he wanted to take as wives. And even Eliza was first introduced to the practice of polygamy by Sarah Cleveland, who was Joseph's wife at the time, who told Eliza all about it while they were roommates in Nauvoo. But there are plenty of other instances where one or two of Joseph's wives would ambush and manipulate a young woman that he wanted as another wife in order to convince her that everything would be all right from a female perspective once she took the prophet's hand in celestial marriage. The Master. We can't possibly cover the lives and stories of over 30 women in a single sitting and say everything that needs to be said. We've only just scratched the surface and skimmed over the highlights of a few of Joseph's wives in our examination today. As our timeline matures through Nauvoo, we'll continue to highlight polygamy in all its forms as it was practiced by the select Mormon elites. The sense of clandestine privilege many of these women enjoyed was but one more tool Joseph would utilize to his benefit. An account published right after the assassination of Joseph and Hiram in Carthage, written by one Joseph Jackson, details how Joseph Smith may have used his trusted women to get some dirty work done. You'll find a link to Jackson's entire expose in the show notes. Quote, "The conversation then turned on other subjects, and Joe boasted of his feats and schemes, and how cunningly he had carried out his measures. He spoke of his spiritual wives particularly and called them great captains in his service to carry his design, and remarked that through them he could get any stranger's money. I asked him how he would work the matter, to which he replied that he had only to tell a certain of his spiritual wives that such a man had been in the Missouri War, and that he should be put out of the way, and his property and money consecrated to the use of the church. Then, said he, it is damned easy for them to get on his good graces, and to mix a white powder with his victuals, and put him out of the way. I then told him that he ought to give me the names of these women, as they might be of great service to me in carrying his secret measures. He then went on to give me the names of women who he said would go to the ends of the earth for him, but I shall not in this place disclose them. End quote. It should be noted that the Nauvoo Expositor corroborated Jackson's writings published in the Warsaw Signal prior to this specific account being published. But there may not be any way to actually corroborate Joseph getting some of his wives to sleep with men and then poison their drinks when he wanted to put them out of the way. It's more food for thought than anything else, but should it hold true, I find it paints a very different picture of Joseph Smith from being that of a pious religious leader, seeking to do God's will, to more something in line of that of a mafia boss or something, with very little scruples about the means he would employ to achieve a specific end. One resounding question Mormon historians have been toiling with for so long is, where does Emma fit into all of this? And I find three possibilities, and the truth probably falls somewhere between the cracks left by these three possibilities. Possibility number one, Emma had no idea that Joseph was practicing polygamy and was ignorant of it until the day she died, giving a very generous reading to her deathbed interview. Possibility number two, Emma knew that Joseph was practicing polygamy but didn't like it and didn't know the extent to which he was practicing. This leaves her deathbed interview as basically a denial where she willfully lied about her past. Finally, possibility number three, Emma knew full well the extent Joseph was practicing polygamy, was similarly opinioned of free love as her husband, and her deathbed denial of polygamy was merely to save face in the late Victorian era where sexuality was a starkly taboo topic of discussion. The truth is probably somewhere among those three. There are ways to interpret the historical record which could substantiate all of these possible interpretations of Emma's deathbed interview. With the most generous interpretation where readers grant full truth to her interview, some will further postulate that Emma's testimony confirms that Joseph never practiced polygamy, that instead it was some massive conspiracy perpetrated by Brigham Young and Heber Kimball. Here's the relevant quote from the article titled Last Testimony of Emma Smith. This was published in the Saints Herald in Plano, Illinois, 1st of October 1879, when Joseph Smith III interviewed his mother about her life with her first husband, Joseph Smith. Quote, Question, what about the revelation on polygamy? Did Joseph Smith have anything like it? What of spiritual wifery? Answer, there was no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. There were some rumors of something of the sort, of which I asked my husband. He assured me that all there was of it was that, in a chat about plural wives, he had said, well, such a system might possibly be, if everybody was agreed to it and would behave as they should, but they would not, and besides it was contrary to the will of heaven. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught, publicly or privately, before my husband's death, that I have now or ever had any knowledge of. End quote. Positing that this interview substantiates the historical model that Joseph never practiced polygamy comes directly into conflict with the rest of the historical records surrounding his life. We should view this as a mother giving an interview to her son about her husband who wanted to keep his and her own good reputation among the anti-polygamy Mormons still living in Nauvoo under the reorganization. There's a whole tangled web of vested interests that brought this interview forward. There are, however, other accounts which paint a much less generous picture of Emma's involvement in Nauvoo polygamy, putting her somewhere on the free love spectrum, or at least open-minded to the idea, and even possibly leveraging Joseph's subservient wives to do Smith's bidding in and around Nauvoo. In a conversation between Wilhelm Weil and William Law in 1887, some interesting perspectives come from Law about his understanding of the Joseph and Emma Smith love dynamic. This may shed some light on why the laws became so opposed to Joseph and Emma and sought to publish Joseph's tyranny in the Nauvoo Expositor. Quote, "Did Emma, the elect lady, come to your house and complain about Joseph?" William Law responds, "No, she never came to my house for that purpose, but I met her sometimes on the street, and then she used to complain, especially because of the girls whom Joseph kept in the house, devoting his attention to them. You have overrated her, sir. She was dishonest." Wilhelm Weil continues the questioning. "Do you mean to say that she was so outside of the influence that Joseph had over her?" William Law answers, "Yes, that is exactly what I mean. Let me tell you a case that will be full proof to you. Soon after my arrival in Nauvoo, the two Lawrence girls came to the Holy City, two very young girls, 15 to 17 years of age. They had been converted in Canada, were orphans and worth about $8,000 in English gold. Joseph got to be appointed their guardian, probably with the help of Dr. Bennett. He naturally put the gold in his pocket and had the girls sealed to him. He asked me to go to his bond as a guardian, as Sidney Rigdon had done. It is only a formality, he added. Foolishly enough, and not yet suspecting anything, I put my name on the paper. Emma complained about Joseph's living with the Lawrence girls, but not very violently. It is my conviction that she was his full accomplice. She was not one bit better than he. When I saw how things went, I should have taken steps to be released of that bond, but I never thought of it. After Joseph's death, Almon W. Babbitt became guardian of the two girls. He asked Emma for a settlement of the $8,000. Emma said she had nothing to do with her husband's debts. Now Babbitt asked for the books she gave them to him. Babbitt found that Joseph had counted an expense of about $3,000 for board and clothing of the girls. Now Babbitt wanted the $5,000 that was to be paid. Babbitt, who was a straight, good, honest, sincere man, set about to find any property to pay the $5,000 with. He could find none. 2 splendid farms near Nauvoo, a big brick house worth from $3,000 to $4,000, the hotel kept by Joe, a mass of vacant town lots, all were in Emma's name, not transferred later, but transferred from the beginning. She always looked out for her part. When I saw how things stood, I wrote to Babbitt to take hold of all the property left by me in Nauvoo and of all claims held by me again in people in Nauvoo. And so the debt was paid by me. Emma didn't pay a cent. Wilhelm Weil continues questioning. What do you remember about Emma's relations to the revelation on celestial marriage? Law answers, well, I told you that she used to complain to me about Joseph's escapades whenever she met me on the street. She spoke repeatedly about that pretended revelation. She said once, the revelation says I must submit or will be destroyed. Well, I guess I have to submit. On another day, she said, Joe and I have settled our trouble on the basis of equal rights. Emma was a full accomplice of Joseph's crimes. She was a large, coarse woman, as deep a woman as there was, always full of schemes and smooth as oil. They were worthy of each other. She was not a particle better than he. End quote. There's a lot to parse out of that exchange and really the whole interview between Wilhelm Weil and William Law, but I'll simply let it stand on its own merits. You can find the entire thing in the show notes if you care to read it, and I would recommend it. This interview is just endlessly fascinating. The actual revelation on polygamy was canonized into the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants as Section 132. The history behind how the revelation came to be is fascinating. This is from the Joseph Smith Papers Project on their entry of the polygamy revelation. The historical note reads as follows, quote, on 12th July, 1843, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation in his Nauvoo, Illinois office in the presence of Hiram Smith and William Clayton. Clayton served as a scribe for the revelation, which, according to Clayton, explained the order of the priesthood, including the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon having many wives and concubines, etc. Clayton later stated that he wrote the revelation sentence by sentence as he, Joseph, dictated. After finishing the dictation, he continued, Joseph asked me to read it through, slowly and carefully, which I did, and he pronounced it correct. According to Clayton's later recollection, the impetus for the dictation of the revelation was Hiram Smith's request that it be written so he could convince Joseph's wife, Emma Hale Smith, who did not approve of the practice of polygamy, of the revelation's truthfulness. After Joseph had dictated the revelation, Hiram took it to Emma and, according to Clayton, received a severe talking to because she was very bitter and full of resentment and anger about plural marriage. Those are both quotes. Hiram then brought the revelation back to Joseph. Clayton stated that it was read to several of the authorities during the day, including Newell K. Whitney, who asked that a copy be made. Joseph agreed, and Joseph Kingsbury, a clerk in Joseph Smith's brick store, carefully copied the revelation the next day. After that copy was made, according to Clayton, Joseph permitted Emma to destroy the original copy. Clayton, however, declared in 1874 that the copy Kingsbury made was a true and correct copy of the original in every respect, and that it had been carefully preserved by Whitney through the years. Kingsbury corroborated Clayton's account of the destruction of the original copy and his own creation of the duplicate copy for Whitney. Using the Kingsbury copy as a source text, the revelation was first published in an extra to the Deseret News on 14 September 1852, following the public announcement of plural marriage. The revelation text was included in a report of the proceedings of a special conference of the elders held 28th through 29th of August 1852, at which Orson Pratt acknowledged on behalf of the church the principle of a plurality of wives and the active practice of plural marriage by church members. Brigham Young had Thomas Bullock read the text of the revelation to those in attendance, and Bullock apparently used Kingsbury's version to do so. After the publication of the extra, the text subsequently appeared in several church periodicals, including the Seer and the Latter-day Saints Millennial Star. It was included in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876, and it appeared in the 1878, 79, 82, 88, and 1891 editions of the Pearl of Great Price. It was first included in the Doctrine and Covenants as Section 132. The introduction to the section in the 1876 Table of Contents identified it as Revelation on the Eternity of Marriage Covenant, including plurality of wives, given through Joseph the Seer in Nauvoo, Hancock, Illinois. In 1886, Kingsbury verified the correctness of these versions, stating that his copy, as also the original, are identical the same as that published in the present edition of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. End quote. The relevant text in Doctrine and Covenants 132 says a number of things. It begins with discussing the prophets of old taking many wives, and explicitly says from God's first-person perspective that he commanded them to take multiple wives to raise up seed. After that, we arrive at a condemnation of Emma, likely relating to the laws or to Hiram Smith or one of the tangled webs of relationships that Joseph and Emma had spun. Starting with verse 32 of Doctrine and Covenants 132, quote, "Go ye therefore and do the works of Abraham. Enter ye into my law, and ye shall be saved. But if ye enter not into my law, ye cannot receive the promise of my father, which he made unto Abraham. God commanded Abraham, and Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. And why did she do it? Because this was the law, and from Hagar sprang many people. This, therefore, was fulfilling, among other things, the promises. Was Abraham therefore under condemnation? Verily I say unto you, nay, for I, the Lord, commanded it." Now on to verse 54. "And I commanded mine handmaid Emma Smith to abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. But if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am the Lord thy God, and will destroy her if she abide not in my law. But if she will not abide this commandment, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even as he hath said, and I will bless him and multiply him and give unto him 100-fold in this world of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, houses and lands, wives and children, and crowns of eternal lives in the eternal worlds. And again, verily I say, let mine handmaid forgive my servant Joseph his trespasses, and then shall she be forgiven her trespasses, wherein she has trespassed against me. And I, the Lord thy God, will bless her and multiply her and make her heart to rejoice." Now on to verse 61. "And again, as pertaining to the law of the priesthood, if any man espouse a virgin and desire to espouse another, and the first give her consent, and if he espouse a second, and they are virgins, and have vowed to no other man, then he is justified. He cannot commit adultery, for they are given unto him. For he cannot commit adultery with that which belongeth to him, and to none else. And if he have 10 virgins given unto him by this law, he cannot commit adultery, for they belong to him, and they are given unto him. Therefore he is justified." End quote. Women are just property. There are reports which survived claiming when Hiram gave Emma the revelation that she threw it into the fire. And that wouldn't be surprising. By 1843, I think Emma may have been a bit fed up with Joseph's relationships and shenanigans and all of the drama that came along with having so many wives. The text of this revelation was circulated among the Mormon elites and used to justify taking more wives with God's commandments. When Joseph and Brigham locked Martha Brotherton and ambushed her in the office above the red brick store, Joseph merely told her that polygamy was right with God and that if there was any sin in it, he'll be the person held responsible before God. But apparently just communicating this sentiment verbally wasn't good enough anymore. For the necessity of having a written revelation in God speak, this revelation was used by a few select men in Nauvoo to gain more wives and justify to their wives the claim that it was a holy law delivered through the mouth of their modern-day prophet. It's understandable how the mind games work here, too. 19th century America was rather averse to polygamy. It was illegal in most states and at the federal level, but so was murder. When you harken back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham knew killing his son was an immoral thing to do, but he attempted to do it anyway, and God stopped him and then blessed him for his conviction in following the Lord's commandments. This could be and was used to illustrate that polygamy may not seem moral to some of these wives, but God has a plan, and sometimes he commands us to do things that we feel are wrong in order to test our conviction to his will. When you always have a God in your corner whom you speak for, you can make any immoral thing sound good. Such was the modus operandi of Joseph Smith from his earliest treasure-seeking days until his untimely assassination in 1844. We all know how Joseph Smith's polygamy came to a close. Eventually, Joseph would overstep his bounds with prominent public figures in Nauvoo in his greedy attempts to claim more and more wives into his harem. Joseph would proposition Sidney Rigdon's daughter, Nancy, who would viciously reject the proposition and sow a major rift between her father and his best friend from the good old days in Kirtland. In response to the situation, Rigdon would only enable Joseph's continued consumption of more women by not speaking out publicly and decrying Joseph's proposition to Nancy, and the two would hold grudges against each other until Joseph's death. Joseph eventually agreed with Emma that he could take the Partridge sisters as wives as long as she was permitted to take William Law as her polyandrous husband on the basis of equal rights, as William Law called it from Emma's own words. Joseph married the Partridge sisters, and he apparently reneged on his agreement with Emma, commanding her in the name of God to cleave to her husband and none else, or she will be destroyed, saith the Lord. It seems that Joseph may have vacillated on his conviction, because he eventually proposed to Jane Law, wife of William Law, to whom Emma was very attracted, and there may have been some talk of like a wife swap scenario or something. The Laws, regardless of whether or not this swapping relationship was consummated, claimed they were dedicated to each other and none else, and took a stand against Joseph and Nauvoo polygamy once and for all by publishing the Nauvoo Expositor. The paper was published exclusively by disaffected Mormon leadership who were angered with Joseph's overreach of powers and extensive flaunting of the law, divine and secular. The editors and publishers are as follows: William Law, his brother Wilson Law, Charles Ivins, Chauncey L. Higbee, Robert D. Foster, and Charles A. Foster. The Nauvoo Expositor had one publication before it was declared a public nuisance by the mayor of Nauvoo, that was Joseph Smith, of course, and the city council. The council ordered the paper and the printing press used to print it destroyed and have their typeset scattered in the street, an order to which the city marshal complied immediately in the dead of night in June 1844. The preamble of the Nauvoo Expositor features explanations for why this group of individuals saw it necessary to publish the work. You'll find a link to a PDF of the entire Expositor hosted on archive.org in the show notes if you want to read the whole paper. Quote, "We most solemnly and sincerely declare, God this day being witness to the truth and sincerity of our designs and statements, that happy will it be with those who examine and scan Joseph Smith's pretensions to righteousness, and take counsel of human affairs and of the experience of times gone by. Do not yield up tranquilly a superiority to that man which the reasonableness of past events and the laws of our country declare to be pernicious and diabolical. We hope many items of doctrine as now taught, some of which, however, are taught secretly and denied openly, which we know positively is the case, and other publicly considerate men will treat with contempt, for we declare them heretical and damnable in their influence, though they may find many devotees. It continues later, we are earnestly seeking to explode the vicious principles of Joseph Smith, and those who practice the same abominations and whoredoms, which we verily know are not accordant and consonant with the principles of Jesus Christ and the apostles. And for that purpose, and with that end in view, with an eye single to the glory of God, we have dared to gird on the armor, and with God at our head, we most solemnly and sincerely declare that the sword of truth shall not depart from the thigh, nor the buckler from the arm, until we can enjoy those glorious privileges which God's nature and our country's laws have guaranteed to us. Freedom of speech, the liberty of press, the right to worship God as seemeth us good. We are aware, however, that we are hazarding every earthly blessing, particularly property, and probably life itself, in striking this blow at tyranny and oppression." End quote. It then goes on to print a number of affidavits talking about the polygamy revelation seen by multiple first-hand witnesses, and it levels a number of well-substantiated accusations against Joseph Smith and the Mormon leadership. The primary focus of the Nauvoo expositor was Joseph's polygamy, issues he would rather keep hidden from the public eye. Once the expositor went to print, it essentially nailed the coffin shut on Joseph proving his sexual and moral improprieties, published by the hands of some of his fallen, trusted Mormon elites. Joseph would be labeled a tyrant in opposition to free speech and locked in the Carthage prison, where he was eventually assassinated for his deeds as a direct result of his widespread practice of polygamy among many other criminal activities. What started as Joseph's earliest possible sexual indiscretions with Eliza Winters and the Stowell sisters during the first years of his marriage to Nauvoo, through the small examples of flings Joseph had in Kirtland and Missouri, what evolved out of this world driven by Joseph's libido was an entire underground network of dozens of marriage. Hundreds or possibly thousands of sexual encounters outside of what was shared between Emma and Joseph eventually became Joseph's Achilles heel and felled possibly the most controversial and epic human of early American history, whose teachings and doctrines would shape the face of Western America for centuries to come. Joseph was a visionary man in every sense of the word. He refused to be constrained by the moral dicta of the society from whence he sprang. His actions directly conflicted with the puritanical morality of strict monogamy and never discussing the bedroom or sexual desires outside of the bedroom. And it flourished in a society with lax regulations and an extreme lack of education. Applying revelations of polygamy ascribed to Joseph from the 1830s merely justifies his later actions and takes them out of the realm of adultery, putting them in a category of divine celestial marriage, in scare quotes. But that's just somehow post hoc excusing Joseph's actions in Kirtland as divinely inspired, when clearly he was just having sex with women who weren't Emma. This is a futile attempt at applying morality to immoral actions taken by the founding father of Mormonism. And what's most baffling to me is Joseph could have approached sexuality differently. He could have created Mormonism as a free love society of, communitarian deists who believe they could ascend to godhood, and it would be treated as such today, instead of hiding all of that behind so much clandestine doctrine that serves to be the public face of Mormonism. Constrained by the Christian societies which birthed Mormonism, free love ran counter to what most converts would consider God's will, and Joseph was forced to practice polygamy underneath the polished Mormon surface, with hypocritical public denials of any sexual impropriety. We shouldn't judge anyone based on their sexual preferences or practices. We should judge them based on the content of their character. Joseph practicing polygamy and free love was an issue because he lied about it. Had he approached it with honesty, he wouldn't have been taken as seriously as he was, and Mormonism would probably be a silverware company today like the Oneida Group evolved into. Instead, Joseph was pining for converts, and he did what he thought was best to not offend the public to gain more followers, even though his public persona widely conflicted with his private preferences. Trying to point out that his actions and lying about them are justified because we happen to have a revelation from 1831 commanding Mormons to practice polygamy is dishonest because it ignores Joseph's dishonesty. It doesn't seem like he was very forthright about his intentions with his relationships. Instead, he spent his time speaking out about the vice and immorality of society, while he himself was constantly locked in the emotional clutches of his own immoral sexuality. And when I say immoral, that's because monogamy, being the only legal form of marriage, was merely a product of Joseph's culture, and that's what was considered moral. Had Joseph been born in a different time and place in a vastly different culture, he may have been able to be more open about free love. But had he sold a platform of free love to his own time and culture, Mormonism would just be a wacky fringe religion practiced by some obscure fundamentalist families. Instead, because of Joseph and Brigham Young's pragmatic approach and ability to keep polygamy barely underneath the surface, Mormonism has grown to be a world religion with millions of adherents and billions of dollars in income with capital and tithing to throw around at their will. Had Joseph been honest about his intentions, Mormonism never would have flourished the way that it did. Had Joseph been a moral person, the American West would look vastly different than it does today. I find the subject of Mormon polygamy particularly important to discuss right now. Not only have we just hit April of 1841 in our historical timeline, marking Joseph's first polygamous marriage in Nauvoo to Louisa Beeman, but it seems like now more than ever, there's been a rebirth in accusations of sex scandals and harassment in all forms sweeping popular media. Lately, it seems every day that people are being fired or indicted on allegations of sexual harassment or assault, an overall positive shift even if some of the short-term impacts seem negative at first glance. Most of these allegations are leveled against rich men in powerful positions, and I'd be willing to bet that the vast, vast majority of the allegations are true. People in society at large are very weird about sex, especially when there's an authoritative power dynamic at play. We see it as a commodity, a reward, a punishment. Sex is a practice or a misdeed. Some versions are moral, others are immoral. It's a way to express power dynamics. It's a way to bind people in a relationship, a mechanism to pass DNA to the next generation, a way to relieve stress. Sex is a way to take out anger, a method to assert control. Sex does so many things for us, and in so many ways, it's used against us. Constructing the sexual profile of a person signals other important characteristics of their personality that we should seek to understand. Joseph may have been a free love advocate in his private life, but he was also a sexual predator in many instances. And being a sexual predator is a bipolar personality trait. Either you're a sex predator or you're not. You're on one end of that spectrum or you're on the other. There's really no excluded middle in this scenario. As soon as Joseph exhibits one sexually predatory practice, he fills a requirement and he can't go back to not being a sexual predator. And I wish that meant something to people. But instead, we elect a power-hungry sexual predator to the office of President of the United States. And we venerate them as our prophets. We need a real sexual renaissance in society today, one unbound by the moral dictates of any specific religion. We need to treat sex in a way that respects everyone's freedom of choice and opens the way for all forms of attraction, identity, and preference. But we're still limited by the societies from whence our modernity arose. Maybe that's the most important takeaway. How we treat sex and our sexuality today is widely not healthy. Society has responded to the claimed morality of religiously approved sex by caving to religion's will and accepting it as the status quo. If there's anything we've learned in viewing the history of sex and relationships, the evolution of how we treat each other shows that we've come a long way. But I don't know where we actually sit on the sexual egalitarianism spectrum. There's probably no way to quantify that. Sex and marriage is arguably more equal among genders and preferences now than it has ever been before, but we're not done evolving our societal norms around healthy sex and love yet. We have a long way to go. And something we can never forget, we're not so far removed from Joseph Smith's time and place. We are closer to Joseph than he was to the Enlightenment. We can judge his character using our modern sense of morality. We're not that different. Mormons laud his name for communing with Jehovah, but they're happy to ignore clear signs of Joseph being a sexual predator. What better way to paint a perfect portrait of the prophet than by ignoring the facts? You just turn it off. That's a powerful Mormon skill that they've been cultivating for over a century and a half. Ignoring the mortal limitations of Joseph and viewing everything he did through diamond-shaped spectacles as a prophet that could do no evil. Not for me. I want the real Joseph living in my brain. I don't want an imposter. I don't want a false portrait. I want the human being who was born in December 1805, wrote the Book of Mormon, led armies, conflicted with government, ran for president, married 30-plus women, and died in June of 1844. I want that human being to exist as a living, breathing human with all of his human limitations and ambitions in my mind. That's the real Joseph Smith. That does it for part 2 of our discussion of the history of polygamy, and particularly the practice of polygamy in the Mormon religion and Mormon history. A little bit of housekeeping before shutting it down. We do our monthly NAMO home evening on the first Monday of every month. However, we are actually moving that this month, so we will not be hosting it on the December 4th Monday. That's this upcoming Monday from when this airs. Instead, we are hosting it on December 11th to accommodate our guests, Dan and Mark of the recently began How to Heretic podcast, as well as the frequent hosts of the Thank God I'm Atheist podcast. I'm super stoked to talk to them. And if you are a supporter at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, check your email on the evening of December 11th. We get started at 6 Pacific Standard Time. That is 9 o'clock Eastern Time. And you will see an email with a link to the Google Hangout should you care to join us and ask any questions and enjoy the conversation with Dan and Mark. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry once again that this was so long, but at least it wasn't 7.5 hours. But as I said at the onset, it's so deep. It's such a massive topic that it took a while to get through so much, and we only just barely peeked around the corner. There's so much more to discuss when it comes to Joseph Smith and polygamy. We don't have any new patrons to thank, so if you would like to pledge to support this endeavor and the research that goes into producing this podcast, please consider doing so at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, where you get access to a plethora of exclusive content just for the patrons, and you gain access to our monthly NAMO home evenings. Thank you so much to those who contribute their time and efforts on the back end to keep the show running. Thank you so much to Julie, who runs the Twitter and Facebook pages. Be sure to follow her at RealEmmaHale on Twitter. Thank you so much to Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to hear more of his music there. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast for providing legal counsel for this show. Thank you so much to the patrons who support the show. And most importantly, thank you once again to all of the amazing listeners out there for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.